Just 1 second. What the fuck is this? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I just thought that, I mean, since the last meeting we had, we kind of tried to very broadly cover the stuff that we did thus far. And I think that hopefully it systematized things enough to clarify like some possible paths we could take with the research and so on. I thought a good idea for today would be for just to speculate a bit based on the stuff we've been researching and so on, how to approach this. And I think that I don't know, I would personally, at least, I was quite convinced that basics, the idea of this basic statement that I proposed at the end, I'm not even sure if I still have that. I should have, right, those slides. There was this.
Yeah, which one again? Remind me.
The one from last meeting. I have it here. That this statement here. Where is it? Apparently, no. I just threw it away. Here. So at the end of it, I added this thing here. Bunch of random drawings, terrible writing. This idea here, which I think it's probably not the best way to formulate it, but I think it's an okay way to start a conversation, you know, like after, actually, I think those two slides should be inverted. So after all the presentation, I ended up like trying to summarize some of the results that, at least the way I understood what we have accomplished thus far, with this couple of these 3 ideas, right? The first one is that not only is the individual perspective not well equipped to directly see social reality, but a given social formation contains several composite measures of social intelligibility, which means there are many ways to, not only is the individual perspective on the social reality not the best one, and there is, let's say, another standpoint, for example, commodity standpoint, sees a lot more about our world than the individual experience standpoint. But it doesn't mean that only the commodity world sees something. It's possible that there are many measures, many kind of ways of exploring this space which are not the individual perspective, right? But though there are many, it also doesn't mean that this exhausts the possibility, right? So I think one statement that we kind of suggest with all the research we've been doing is, first, that one should take seriously that money, for example, is a better, or the commodity forms, a better goggle, better glass to see social reality than, for example, the way it arrives at you immediately as a given. But so that could be, let's say, a theory about fetishism or about capitalism as a totality. But then there is the other statement that that doesn't mean that money or the commodity form is the only way to see social reality. There might not only might there currently be other such perspectives or such points of view, right? Like the state point of view, the point of view of communities and so on, but you could also construct other ones which are not these, right? And I think that then, so this is a sort of analytic point about from where can you look at society and the social formation and how to make it intelligible and so on. And then there is this kind of more synthetic point, which is a bit more, even more crazy, right? I think this first one is very well contained in, for example, the work Dennis and I did on the primer. It kind of talks about this a lot. What does it mean for money to look at the world, for capital to look at the world? Why are those things different? It gives open space for us to talk about what does it mean for the state to look at the world? What does it mean for communities to look at the world, right? But then there is a synthetic point of view, or this more prescriptive or politically political one, which is that the theory of social measure, or the theory of social intelligibility, right? The meaning the way we describe how to make the world intelligible is not totally distinct from the theory of causation. And we explored one connection between intelligibility and causal power, which is the whole discussion we had on these resolutions, right? The fact that the determinant of the resolution of the world, right? The effective resolution at which you can intervene is instrumental, right? So for example, when we're talking about fractals, fractal geometry, Notal, and so on, we saw how he connects, let's say, the scale of analysis with, let's say, the constraints that the instruments that take measurements have. So there is a kind of relation between what you can make intelligible and what you can intervene upon, which is a more strict connection than simply, knowledge and action. Things are a bit more connected. And I think, actually, now that I think of it, I think it's very important that we chose a metaphor of perception, like what commodities see, rather than a metaphor of knowledge, like what commodities know, right? For example, when we talk about objects in front of you, you don't talk about the fact that you know there is a computer in front of you. You say that you see it, even though there is already a lot of abstraction, because there is no computer in front of you in a certain sense, but a bunch of matter or parts of stuff. So to say you see a computer is kind of to talk about a very sensitive or sensible relation to abstractions. It's not a theoretical relation, right? So I think when we talk about social intelligibility, we're also talking about that. For example, I know that there is such a thing as, I don't know, repressive police power. It's a knowledge, a theory about the world. But it's very different to look at a person on the street and see the police's repressive power, right? It's still an abstraction in a way. You're reducing the officer with the uniform to the police aspect of who he is, but you're not doing it in a theoretical way. It just is a thing that appears, right? So I think that's a relevant distinction. But anyway, so this idea that intelligibility is somehow connected with the capacity to cause things, and I propose this kind of weird formulation to say that the means for social components to see one another, right, parts of the world to feel each other, or for one part of the world to make a difference to another part of the world, in the sense of, let's say, information about one is relevant to the other, is related to their means of interaction with other social objects. So for one thing to send information to another has some relation to the capacity of one thing to cause or to change or to interact with one another, right? And then I propose, yeah.
This is starting to sound, I think, a lot like, I think in the context of that talk from Tony Smith, sounding like almost like the context, right, in like the, I guess, like topos, whatever, of social worlds, of like a cybernetics or something, right? Going towards like, the goal is like, what is the morphology, right? What is like sort of like an maybe like optimal strategies in different contexts, right?
Yeah, I think it's a lot to do with this idea that you're talking about a form, right? So morphology in that sense, about it as being a certain way of constraining something that exists, such that some properties of information, but so some constraints can be passed along, right? I think that's why the paper you guys want to present connects a lot with this as well. This whole debate in the mathematics behind these intuitions, it's very natural to move between this idea of how things get the form that they get and the ways in which they get to interact with other things. Those two things seems to be very connected, right? So I propose this.
Yeah. Also, this whole thing that you said before about like the seeing metaphor, about how you don't see it as it is, but just as it appears, is very much like the also from just connecting it from that talk. When they were talking about bundles and fibrations, generally when you like make them into a full category, which is like a higher type over something else, right? It also, that Gödel paper that you sent is like, at least gives me the idea I got through like, most of it, but not the last proof, of doing this like higher order type, but over some like finite world. So you can still prove things without like crazy infinite consequences necessarily.
Yeah, I do feel like these things
I just
are
want to draw the
connected.
connections.
Yeah, but my cheeky general proposition, which is this one here, which is not a formal one, it's a purely political one, right? It's, I think, the thing that personally, that's what I take to be the next challenge, right? How do we ground that these three things are equivalent in some level? And again, social knowledge here, you should take in the sense I just described before, the sort of practical knowing or like intelligibility, not in the sense of theoretical knowing, right? And it's funny because when you take it in this sense, you can understand why theoretical knowledge can get in the way. Because once you think you already know, you don't think you need to see, right? So once you think you have like you're in a very small collective that has like does popular agriculture with, you know, organic food, you have a theory about nature, about effects on climate, about capital, but that's a theory. You have those things as mental things in your head, and you use them to justify connections between what you do and the totality. But it doesn't mean that you do things that make you see climate and see capital structures. For example, a national economy, people in the central bank in Brazil, in a certain sense, capital makes a difference. They don't need to have a theory about it, in the sense of, even in fact, sometimes it would be a good thing if they had a theory, but I mean, you can substitute that for a kind of sensitivity, right? It's like there is an organ, like an eye, that captures information about what differences, that are global differences in capital flows and things like this. So they don't have a theory about the way that the small collective has a theory, but they see it, whereas the small collective doesn't, right? So what we're looking for is this idea of seeing, like a very classic intelligibility idea, right? So in a certain sense, there are differences in capital that make a difference to a national economy, whereas you can't really say that differences that make a difference to a small collective comes from, they can track it back to capital. They can track it back, for example, to the police officer who comes and, due to the mayor's insistence, you know, tries to take them off the land or something like that. That's something they don't need a theory about. That makes a difference, right? But there's a bunch of parts of the structure of the world which are not intelligible in that way. And I think that more perceptive metaphor of, you know, something that truly makes a difference, and you might theorize it about later. You might theorize wrongly about it, but that doesn't mean you're not being affected by it, right? So social knowledge here comes in the sense of things that are intelligible, and not in a theoretical sense, but in the sense that they make a difference, right, in terms of information. So the crazy proposition is that social difference is correlate or equivalent in some way to your capacity to intervene politically on something, which is equivalent to the way you're organized, right? So for example, the central bank is organized in some way that it can change the flow of money, put more money into circulation. The things that make a difference to it also make, so that's its organizational structure, and that's a material one. It needs to have a hierarchy of managers, a certain level of pay amongst them, so that they personally are not affected by the fluctuations that they cause mostly, right? The relation that it has to the state, with communities, with commodities, and so on. All of that is the organizational structure that renders it capable of certain interactions. For example, putting more money into circulation, changing the how do you call it in English? Juros.
Interest rates.
The interest rates. Thank you. Yes. And the things that make a difference for it. So this sort of trinity of equivalence puts a sort of common perspective, something about information, something about interaction, and something about composition. How something is composed of parts of the world is connected to what it can do, is connected to how it can be affected by the world, right? It's a sort of constructive Spinozism. Like, we don't, without accepting any of Spinoza's premises about God, nature, adequate, not all of that is wrong, but you can locally construct the theory of bodies that are effects and affected by things that have adequate knowledge, and so on and so forth, right? So so my impression is that we managed to show at least a good chunk of this with the primer, though it's still a lot of work to make it clear. But we were able to show that there is a language in which, if you construct an object like money, it is able to capture information about commodities. If you construct out of it a larger object, which is capital, you are able to capture the difference, the variations between productive processes, and therefore the organic composition and so on, right? And you can construct an even larger object with total social capital, which is able to see competition, right? And kind of be seen in a way by competition. So those are ways of organizing that define a certain scope of intervention, because organic composition of capital is a practical intervention. It's not a theoretical thing. No capitalist thinks about this, but they do think about more intense labor, new ways of combining machine and people, new ways of reducing the time of circulation so that the turnover time and profit comes earlier, new strategies for investment, and so on. And this also makes the world appear in some way. Some things make a difference, and then new things start making difference. So if you change your organizational structure, for example, your organic composition, this makes you capable of new things and also makes new things intelligible. So nobody cared about some chemical compound, but once some competitive structure requires, I don't know, dental paste, toothpaste makers to find new things to explore, right? Technically, they become capable of extracting a property from some chemical compound, and now that chemical compound is relevant. It makes a difference if it's there or not there. So this theory applies to all of this. And the question is that we want it to also apply to political organizations. We're saying that it is a more general idea than a capitalist idea, right? If you change the organizational structure, that should change the things you're capable of interacting with, which should change the things that make a difference. Because those are just three ways of describing the same thing, ultimately. Right? So
I think this Trinitarianism almost gives me, I won't say like it's exactly correlative to this, but it gives kind of the vibe of Karatani's, right, modes of exchange a little bit. Like social knowledge is maybe something like it's like on the individual level, then organizational structure is something like a state. And you have the, I guess, I don't know, capitalism would be politics, just being the most, including everything in this sense. It's just kind of a Yeah, I don't know.
I would map his modes a bit differently because, for example, what Karatani shows is that, I mean, some people, for example, criticize him because he doesn't talk
Yeah.
about nature or technology, like things that are very hype today. But if you read in the book, the way that he does it is by saying that if you live in an animistic society, you will have an animistic view of nature. So things that fit into the gift economy, those parts of nature that fit into the gift economy, they will appear, and you through the relations you have with them. Technologies that fit those modes of exchange will fit that society, and other things will not appear, and so on, right? So I would take the modes of exchange as modes of composition, right? So it's correlative to each mode of composition that they make some things appear and others not, that they make you capable of interacting with some things and not with others, right? And it
Yeah,
seems
I think that's kind of where the metaphor, that's kind of where I meant to take it. I think that's a good way of putting it.
I think that on let's say on the very basic theoretical level, that's the complicated thing that I think follows from the language or the grammar of the primer, that it becomes possible to speak in a strictly Marxist way, in the sense that you don't lose any of Marx's nice ideas about this sort of structure. You can look at and I think that it even explains some very interesting things because, for example, if you are part of a radical black movement in the States, things that make a difference to you, not at the level of theory, you can have the most complicated intersectional theory, but things that make a difference to you are different than things that make a difference, for example, to a small, radical communist party that is also in the States. Like, and not due to principles, due to the way you're composed, right? For example, for the Black movement, it's very important to have Black people in positions of protagonism. And you can measure if that's the case or not, due to the way that things are composed, the hierarchy inside of the organizations, to the places where the organization is better rooted and not. Those things make a difference, right? They can make you contradictory with your own kind of intervention principles, right? So you can measure if you're losing ground, gaining ground based on those things. That would lead you to see the world in a certain way. For example, police brutality will be very much in the center of the picture, and you might describe the world, a description that takes colonization as the prime historical movement might make more sense. It captures more of that information, whereas talking about capital and commodity flows and things like this seems secondary. Whereas for other group, it might be the inverse, right? So we can kind of account for why the world looks so different from different organizational groups, and not based on their theories, because they can be very incompatible, but actually starting a bit before that and saying, well, it's likely they will adopt the theories that account the best for things that make a difference, right? So it kind of provide, I mean, in the least, if it doesn't allow us to think of new ways of intervening, in the least scenario, in the worst scenario, it at least gives us a way of talking about politics that already exists in a less stupid antagonistic way, because you start correlating organizational structures and what makes a difference to that organizational structure, and you can account for why it's not the same difference for everyone, right?
It seems like back to the Trinitarianism, it seems like each one of the three, I guess, like equivalences seems like a different way of organizing some sort of like collective structure over I guess like a society, right? Like social knowledge is something that is experienced on the level of the individual, but it's tied together, I guess, through like language and being able to agree and talk about things, right?
Yeah.
Political intervention has its collective form, I guess, like in maybe like futurity or something like that. And then organizational structure is, I don't know, something like the, I guess the way the individuals are connected materially or something, or causally.
Yeah. Well, I think one
Something
thing that
like
you
that,
said
though.
that
I
makes a
don't
lot
know.
of sense to me is that we can explain quite easily why individuals, it's why it's so hard to remove politics from the standpoint of individuals, because individuals guarantee that equivalence at a very weak level, but they do, right?
Yeah.
What an individual knows, what one can interact with, and how one is materially dependent on the world. That kind of gives what we have from Marx and Mao Zedong, the theory of class position, right? Your class organization tends to give you an outlook on the world that's like what is intelligible and relevant to you. And it's also connected with the reach of your kind of activities, right? So
Yeah.
in the weakest form, let's say not constructing any new objects, just by taking the individual as this object that is kind of maintained by every transcendental, right? There is a notion of individuality that is connected with mode C, mode B, and mode A. That's, let's say, the weakest form of this equivalence would be the individual. You don't need to pay for your, I mean, just by working, you keep the composition of your bodily sensors, right? Your perceptions. Your organization keeps your capacity to perceive the sort of world around you, and that gives you a certain outlook of what makes a difference, right? So I think that to focus on the individual is kind of to focus on it's a sort of, is the one construct that respects these properties that our current social form guarantees, which is not a necessity, right? For example, Karatani talking about Japan, he says that this is actually faulty in Japan in a way, because you can't really speak about yourself as the point of view from which you see things. You can only, it's more culturally acceptable to make yourself the representative of something else, and that something else is a relevant kind of agent, you know? So to speak in this first person, sort of individual subject form would be a bit uncommon culturally, but generally you could say that Western capitalist societies, they guarantee that sort of quasi equivalence, right? The weakest form of this in the form of an individual, somebody who perceives the world from his own standpoint or her own standpoint, has a certain notion of the world that maps that individual into it, right? Makes the world intelligible in a way that you exist, and that also works and is organized in society in such a way as to guarantee that this is reproduced, right?
Interesting, because psychoanalysis is this kind of not at the individual level, right? That you need more than just the individual to come up with an intervention of a particular type, which would reorganize or restructure an individual's way of living, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, that, you know, like this was the first place where I kind of got the intuition for the stuff we're doing now. Like the fact that you need the analyst to form like a duo, you need two to be able to see relations that are also dual between people, like love relations, and to intervene upon them. That's kind of the thing I first started trying to understand, and that made this idea, this generalization kind of possible. So I went from like the individual to the transference, which is a situation where the standpoint from which you see what you say and what you feel, you shift it to this composite of two people, what Freud called a mass of two, right? A massa de duas pessoas, a mass of two. And from that perspective, the things that can be actual, right, in transference, like the things that make a difference, are different than the ones that make a difference for an individual, and therefore you can cause them, you can change them in a way, right? So that idea that you need to acquire a certain form in order to treat things of that form. The first place where I saw this was in transference, which is not a good thing because it's like a quasi-charlatan practice giving credence to a even more obscure idea, you know?
Yeah.
No, we have a basis for this idea. It comes from that obscure practice. People are already saying it's fake. But it gives a good example.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about this duo theme seems to apply at higher levels too. I mean, even like in the context of like, let's say a union, the union only makes sense with respect to the company in which it is, or the industry in which it is like intervening on, right? So there is kind of a dual thing, right? Like if you have a work stoppage, that's a form of political intervention, but that work stoppage only makes sense if you have generally a theory about how that work stoppage will affect this other entity.
Yeah, but I don't think that the idea of a duality is preserved for larger things. I think that's precisely the numerical thing is the thing that changes, right? So to intervene in love relations, which are dual, you need the dual setting. To intervene in collective relations, you need a collective setting. That's, you know, like the cardinality is a relevant fact here, right? And it's not necessarily true that, I mean, I do think that we could analyze trade unions in this way. The more that the trade unions are defined by the trade and not by the union, so it's the set of a specific type of workers and not the fact that it's a collective of workers, the tendency is that it only affects negotiations within that trade, right? So it makes a difference. I mean, I'm talking about this because trade unions have a very ambivalent status today, right? On the one hand, they seem to actualize something about a collective worker, right? And on the other hand, that actualization is kind of bargaining with the world by saying it exists if it exists as a set of specific type of workers, right? And to recognize that already requires you to bargain what you can do, right? So I would even say that this might be a good way to distinguish it. If we go back to the Trinity, right? What is made intelligible, what it can interact with, and how it's organized. Trade unions, many times, they don't want to see the world differently. They want to be seen by the world as it is, right? So they will adopt a structure that is compatible with the world as it is. Let's say, if instead of having meetings with your boss, which is a way to transmit information about what's going on, you set the office on fire, you won't be transmitting information that the other recognizes, right? So that's a restriction. Like if you're only gonna organize meetings to negotiate some demands, you're constraining your capacity, which implies you're constraining how you're organized, which also makes only certain things intelligible, right?
I was rereading that text. I don't know if you remember on the memes with force of that idea. They wrote a part 2, and it's interesting because I think it's in line with this. They start with this kind of like critique of. They start by saying that like contemporary political thought cannot make sense out of the contemporary revolts that happen in like France and Chile and etc. And a lot of that, there are like kind of the description of this paradigm is that this political thinking is based on a form of like a reduction to political thinking to representation and discourse, kind of as if the social move, like that, political action in general is like a text. So there's a lot of this kind of like textual metaphor that we've also discussed, in which the what he calls like this the social movements apparatus, it becomes this this machine that reads what's actually happening and identifying actors, making this kind of like movement legible to, like, is this idea of like identify actors and finding the demands, right? Of the, so it is as if politics is this operation of kind of like representing whatever is happening at some level, lower level, and but it's, and so he proposes instead that we should kind of like ground. He pushes for a more like materialist thinking of like trying to ground all these representations into like actual practices inside the movement, and then things would be more intelligible. And so when you do this, I realized how this kind of like discursive or representational way of looking at politics is, sometimes you can frame it as exactly the way that the state sees the social movements, right? Because it's not actually the point of view of let's say the movement itself, but it's the mechanisms, the organizational mechanisms that render legible the movement as demands, as certain actors representing certain like social identities. So I don't know, I was thinking about how there's this interesting movement in trying to kind of like ground the political discourse into trying to figure out what exactly are the organizational forms and practices that are actually being actualized by this discourse. So yeah, in this case, I mean, the trade union often becomes this kind of mechanism, this interface that renders workers' movements legible to the state. So in this sense, it's this kind of like
I think that's a good example, because I remember this text. He says, like, today political theory knows radical actors but not radical actions, right? And I think the whole movement is saying that the tendency to make demands clear and to bring it into representation is to reduce actions back to actors, right? You want to know who you're talking to.
Yeah, and this legibility of the actor, finding the actors and finding the demands, is actually what makes it homogeneous in a sense to the state, right? Because the state can only work with identified actors and identified demands, and that's kind of like the kind of like resolution or knowledge it's able to speak and kind of like negotiate. So it's interesting, like how from this point of view you are able to actually identify like these mechanisms of producing like knowledge that becomes legible, not necessarily to the movement itself, because it might also hinder their own practice, but maybe to the state. So
but this is the thing. I remember when reading that text that I was a bit which I think is it's our contemporary limits. I think everyone is facing this challenge, and I think that we are building something that can help with that, because you want to be able to say that there is a difference between an actor for the state, which needs to have some properties, to speak in the name of something else, to present demands. Like, those are the way you need to organize in order to have interactive power with the state, in order to make yourself intelligible to the state, and also to be able to recognize some things about who's in charge in the state and things like this. But that doesn't mean that every form of intelligibility or every way you can count an actor has to be this, right? And sometimes it seems like to protect the power of a revolt from capture, you need to suspend your like theory of how these things can be intelligible and just let it be, right? And perhaps you can go further than this, like what, as exactly as you say, like what are actors of a movement to a movement, right? They can fall under different properties. So, for example, the very rotation of who is coordinating a certain action might be what qualifies the coordinator, whereas towards the state is the inverse. If it's always the same person, he's more likely the relevant actor, right? So you can have different properties that make different things intelligible, and that also are supported by different forms of organizing and so on, right? So
yeah, it seems like what's really interesting is moving away from the model where you conform yourself to something that the state consents or capital consents, and instead shift to the question of what can you do to sense things differently in your own structure.
yeah, I think that's what really makes that idea of political phenomenology strong. Like if it's only about, let's say, almost like a conspiratory way, like if you look at things from this perspective, the world reveals itself as an analytic or critical point of view, it might be nice, but it's quite limited, you know. Ultimately, people might say that if you have the best theory about the world, that's enough. The part where it becomes really interesting is where you get to say things like, well, depending on how you organize, you get to see different things. Like it's more, you know, Hayek had the idea of the man on the go, and the information that is relevant to the man on the go, right? The guy who is buying, how do you call it, like dough to make bread, right? Or who is doing like buying water and flour and doing the bread. The price of water, the price of flour, those are relevant informations for him. He doesn't have a general theory of capitalism. He only has those informations are relevant information. And that's a kind of localized social phenomenology, right? It's very restricted. It's totally compatible with private property, market economy, and so on. But it's kind of addressing a different thing. That's why I think he was kind of pulling the carpet below the socialists in that he had a good point by distinguishing between theoretical knowledge about the economy, knowing the laws of economy, and the actual, let's say, information that makes a difference to local decentralized actors, right? So I think that's also a bit of what we're looking for. Like, how does this, what is the phenomenology of this for political action, right? And the idea is to condition that to certain organizations, because ultimately, even in Hayek, that is conditioned on market organization. If the bakery couldn't count on certain laws, couldn't count on a certain price stability, they couldn't use that information themselves. So there is an organization behind that guarantees them some capacity to work with the stuff, right? To combine some things to make bread, and that makes some things intelligible. So I think it's that more prescriptive, more politically minded side of this phenomenology. That's really where the cool part is, because of course this already exists. People are already using this every day when they're doing any sort of activity, with going to a protest or organizing anything or so on. That's kind of relevant, right? But with those links between all these elements, I don't think they're very clear. So even that basic statement, I think, is already quite something. Just to say, you know, depending on how you organize, different things make a difference. It's kind of stupid, but it's already something in a way, right? But it's not very clear how to explore that idea, I think. And I have the impression that we hit upon a couple of more formal ideas recently that do touch on this nicely, right? These guys who are studying this open games and studying machine learning and things like this, they are kind of trying to what they call open learners, right? This idea that you can have a dynamical system that approximates some predicative function, some function becomes more restricted and clearer the more you act in a certain way. So interaction and that kind of epistemic aspect, they're quite closely connected, right? With the whole back propagation idea and so on. So I don't know, it seems like it might be a promising place to look, I think.
Yeah, I think if we were going to rewrite the primer today, it would probably start from that, or at least in the second version of the primer, it would be starting with a different type of basic unit, not the commodity form, but this learner thing that senses its environment and updates some internal state, and then sends information backwards, as if it were the environment of another actor, right? Another learner.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I would change things in the primer, though. I mean, I would change one. There is one place where I think it fits very nicely, because in the middle of the whole construction, right, when we got to define what, like, we defined this as, we took Marx writes race, right? Money becomes labor power plus means of production. This becomes a commodity, then it's sold, and you get a different money, right? We rewrote it as have some money, it becomes labor power. It composes with means of production. This gives you a product that is then sold for more money, right? So it's valorized. And when we tried to expand this, we came up with that idea that, let's say the very basic idea for this is that you have some means of production and you have some labor power. Means of production goes straight into this production box that takes you to the product, but labor power has a different structure. We added this thing we call the resolution box, and the resolution box goes here, right? And this updates the resolution box. Why did we do this? Because we wanted to show that that labor is actually this very big set of things. We don't know what they are because they're not made of commodities, right? In the case of means of production, everything that is inside of means of production was actually produced before, talking about like things that are not natural resources, right? So this is a commodity, this is a commodity, or they were combined in some way to make this. So you know what's kind of inside of here. But labor is not a commodity, so you don't know what's inside of labor. So you need a sort of filter or a sort of lens, in fact, right? A way to kind of sort out what you want from inside of this. So the idea is that labor goes into this process, but this process also kind of refines what you need from labor, right? So this is kind of like the investigation of what labor can do, kind of box, right? And we showed this is useful in many ways. So in a certain sense, inside of our very description of production, there is already a feedback structure when we wanted to talk about labor.
Yeah.
So it seems like what these guys are doing could substitute this. And actually, since their whole idea is that you have a set, right? It goes into some function that does something and gives you some output. But there's also something else coming from the other side, which is like an update thing that will change this, and this thing informs this thing.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
And that's like the picture of a lens.
Yeah, this is the lens, right?
I just drew this, the backwards S. That's
Yeah.
what would make our thing similar to this thing, right? Because actually every production process is getting feedback from the market when you sell the
Wait,
product.
So if we try to replace from the bottom left picture into the right picture, like where would, I'm trying to think. So labor power would be the X's.
Yeah, in this picture here, you could say that this is our parts of labor power, right? But I mean, you don't even need to bring this
Feedback,
all the way
yeah,
to.
it's gonna be the resolution, yeah.
Yeah, you don't need to bring this all the way to I'm exchanging the product for money, and then let's say, no, you cannot, or it's too cheap, or it's not well made, and then you go back. You can just have like a manager who sees the product and says, it's not well made, or it's too slow, right? So you do something, you might have done it in a slow way, you need to update it and do it faster, you know?
It's a process that can change itself, basically. Yeah. Is like, I think the easiest way to think about what a lens is.
Yeah, so I think what's nice about it is that it's not simply like this goes here, right? You do something and then this goes back to the beginning, like a more intuitive or simple feedback. Is the idea that you do something, you save a state, and then this plus the state is the thing that composes to give you back this thing, right? Actually, I think this is a specific type of lens. You can have more complicated ways of changing the parameters, right? There can be a parameter going here and a parameter going out.
So would it be fair to say on, I guess, two levels, like on the one hand, any organization that functions as an organization has some kind of update function. And on the other hand, if our organization is not picking up the kind of information we think is politically relevant, this update function is a particularly important place to focus our attention.
Yeah, I think that if we start very small, what are we saying? If this makes sense, which is not obvious because we don't know how to implement this yet, if it makes sense, it would qualify us to say that labor itself, I mean, just to give one extra really cool thing about this idea, right? So you have this, let's say, a function that does something, like an input and an output, and you have this update going backwards, right? Where are these inputs coming from, right? So you could write in the environment here, right? These are coming from the environment. You do something, they go out, you get some response based on what happened, right? And they show that this, if you call this the environment, this comb, this structure here is just the same as this. So if you take this process here, right, take two of them, sorry, this is like this, right? If you take two of these, if you take this bottom one here and you invert it, just in a drawing, I think I have the drawing here. This guy made this really cool version of it.
Yeah, the Bruno guy.
Yeah, the Bruno guy. Where is
He had a great talk on this stuff.
fuck, I erased it. Here. He just drew this picture, which I think makes it nice and clear. So.
Oh yeah, this one.
So you see, like this environment here is just exactly the same structure. If you just unpack it, open it like this, and hide it, that's the same structure. So you remember when Bogdanov was saying, yeah, well, ultimately, the distinction between if you're acting or reacting, if you're the system or the environment, is a relative distinction, right? Well, this structure here, which is the environment, and this structure here, which is the system, if you just change perspectives, you keep the same formalism, but they invert. So it's a matter of perspective if your environment or the system, right? It's not different things. So this is very nice, a very good kind of entry point to talk about organizations as little systems inside of an environment, and this gives something else and receives some reaction, right? And then it updates itself and so on. And then you say, but what is this? You can just shift your perspective and this becomes a system exactly like the other one, but you can say like this, right? Perhaps this goes this way, you're cutting it differently. And these two arrows now function as the inverse, and this is doing this. So it kind of fits with the way Bogdanov thinks about what an organization is. Like those basic axioms of organizations are not substantially a system opposed to the environment, but they look like agents that act and against something that reacts only because of the standpoint, right? That would give a treatment to this thing we were talking about. Right, this would make this part here redescribe, we would be redescribing it as a very small organization, right? Where labor staking some MP here, going into this do box, it comes out as some stuff, like let's say a commodity, but then there's something about this commodity or this space of its products that updates something about labor, right? So this description here, which then has some environment to it, actually already is closer to the description of labor as an organization with this sort of back propagation structure and so on. And more than that, it gives it an epistemic, it clarifies that it has an epistemic component, right? That what it does affects its own parameters, right? And these guys, they go very far with what these parameters can be. It can actually connect with a map of the world, like actually a way of looking. Doesn't need to be simply like a simple way of, I was hammering something 3 times a minute, now I'm hammering it four times a minute. Like you can have more, a richer, I think that's actually connected with the difference between optics and lenses, right? The things that are part of these parameters for an optics can be more complicated and less strict than the previous state of the system, right?
Yeah, you have long-term memory or some kind of like history if you want.
So with this change, this becomes already, let's say, like the same formalism would apply to much larger things. You can imagine, for example, the way that I would approach this today is this: imagine you have a capitalist social formation. What that means? It means that all the objects, everything that is composed in our world, can be reduced to these 3 ways of looking at it. Sorry, this is B, right? This is A, or combinations of those. Right, so the idea is from the primer, the idea is that every object in our world can be, it's made of these 3 ways of looking at the world, all at the same time, but you can reduce it back, for example, to just look the community part of it, or just look the legal part of it, or just look the commodity part of it, or the commodity plus the community, or the commodity plus the state part, right? Or the state plus the community part of it. So you can imagine that you have a world made of these objects, right? So it belongs to some crazy set plus this weird logic. And you want to interact with them in a weird way. So you would have them here and you do something, and that should affect some change. And you should be able to learn something from this, right? Like my current problem. So I think that this, to go back to what John asked, like what would be an environment here, right? I think it would be something like this is the world, which is this, right? And this is actually the body, like this is the new thing, right? For example, you can have some weird organization which has many of these actions and some parameters for acting on objects of the world. For example, recomposing them or looking for some stuff inside of them. And this could be like a body, like for example, a social movement, right? This can be larger, much larger than what the scope that this thing acts on it, for example, perhaps. But at least this would give it, like, you can compose this objects here, these functions. So you can imagine this becoming like a kind of object in its own right. It has a weird epistemological component in the sense that it has parameters, it has constraints, it can change them, you can kind of augment something about them, right? And that these two things are related to this capacity for interacting.
Yeah, I like this because you can think then of the, I guess, like, if we can think of an organizational structure as something like one of these lenses, then its morphology, right, is like the paths that it takes in its like configuration space. So, right, for example, if it's like a company, it would be given every possible situation, right, that it would I guess like run into, what would it do given all the conditions? So obviously you can't know it fully, but you can experiment and figure out what would happen in different circumstances, right?
Yeah.
That's also interesting to think about in terms of compositionality, because like if you think about, like, if you're problem solving in a big company, you might not be thinking about it in terms of like strict commodity logic. You might be thinking in terms of TA, like who in the clique of a business do I need to talk to get the permission slip or authorization to do something? And you might no longer be thinking in the strict kind of logic of a commodity, but you're still thinking within the kind of social knowledge of a company. And likewise, if you're trying to think through like the chain of command within a modern corporation, which again isn't commodity logic, it's based on military structure. So
Yeah.
It kind of like different problems emerge differently within the object based on those different exchange transcendentals.
So for example, in this case, you could say that, you know, if you have some set of, I don't know, LP and MP belonging to an object, right? You can do things with it. For example, you can valorize them and they will compose some new object C that also belongs to this world, right? It's also, you can also see it in terms of these things. And this can tell you something about, for example, how you should go on producing, right? So this is, let's say, totally inside of this world. This is a move that went like this ultimately. Whereas politics, we could define as something like this. And I'm saying this just to bring into the picture the antagonism that John asked about, right? So what do we want to substitute here for? We want to substitute here using, to be the nerdy Badiou, we want to substitute it for points. And for Badiou, points are this sort of kind of conservative relations, right? They preserve conjunction and envelope. It takes you from a transcendental to this Boolean transcendental, right? Just 0 or 1, right? So just add that Boolean here and have an object that there is some part of this object that you don't get to see it only by looking at C, B, and A. You need to add this other thing to see parts of it, right? Not all of it. And in a certain way, you could imagine reducing it back to all of this, right? But there are some things about it that are only intelligible if you consider it from this perspective, right? Something like that.
Does that mean you have to construct TD as opposed to kind of like a more revelational model or something in Karatani or transcendent? I don't know. You characterize.
Yeah. This is the whole point. Like this T0 here only means it's a local evaluation, right? So for Badiou, the whole point is that you had something in T, and you can take this point of P, right? And it will go either to 1 or to 0. And the set of all points, what he calls, so all positive points for this degree, so all positivations of P, meaning all P such that phi of P equal 1. He shows that this has a topological interiority, right? This forms an interior, something that has, you can take it, separate it from the outside. And then he shows that you can take many of these things, PQ, and if you have something that it didn't exist in the world and that is serving as a sort of trace, right? This can make these things, you can guarantee that these things are compatible if they're both smaller or ordered by that trace. So you can form larger, you're like forming a system, right, of conditions and connections out of these local evaluations. It doesn't mean you know the global, so you don't need this to be TD, like a general logic. It's a local thing.
I think I like to think of it as like a point of decision, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it picks out something from this like intuitionistic transcendental structure, and it I guess like unifies it into a singular like new thing, right?
Yeah, I think it's like you said, it's converting of fuzzy sets into actual sets. It's another way to think of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get the idea of how this is put to use here, I think better.
I think this point should actually be in the reverse arrow going backwards, because the arrow going forward, the do arrow is like doing an experiment, I think. I think it fits that model of you try something, and then the backwards arrow is how the response of what you did should update your internal view of the world, right? So it seems like the
I
point.
see. So you're saying something like, so for example, you have some parts of this object, right? For example, some parts of a company, right? And you want to do something to them, and you're going to see what happens, right?
Exactly.
Depending on what happens, this, for example, will give you either yes or no.
Exactly. You still decide, but you're deciding with the response of the response of the experiment that happened. Then you have to decide, okay, did that response confirm or disprove my hypothesis, let's say, or
yeah, you know, this brings us
that's the change of the whys, right?
Yeah, this is the big problem with Logics of Worlds mapping, the greatest fault with the book, which is that he doesn't make it clear, like when he writes this, you have this function here, right? The structure of this function is totally to be decided, right? So for example, you have some object in the capitalist world, and we're saying, for example, that workers who have no relation because they function like private contractors with no contract and so on, that they're actually related in some concrete material sense. They can help each other, like delivery workers or whatever. The experiment would be, let's say, the predicative part here, right? It's like defining some content to this function, right? And the yes or no is what it maps to. right? So the point actually has some form that recomposes things, right? So for example, this thing here is supposedly disjunct from this other thing. And the point is like asking, okay, does this thing here together does it have consequence, right? Bringing these two things together or considering them as one, right? Some weird collective. And then you check if this thing, yes, it does, or no, it doesn't, right? So this move from these things are separate to they are combined. This would be the do, right? And the yes or no, this would be the update. Is that it?
Yeah. I think so. But wait, what is X? What is the little X again?
Yeah, just take like parts of this object, right? So
Okay.
parts of a company, for example. And a company is built in this world, right?
Could you interpret, like I was trying to interpret like the do as sort of like some tactic that is kind of like singular, or like you're just trying to navigate political space in some part and react to it in some intelligent way, but it's not something that you can repeat per se, because it's just an action. And this kind of feedback that you kind of evaluate, and your capacity to evaluate, is some sort of like strategy, which kind of divides whether you're advancing or no in some strategic way. And this efficacy is given by the way you can actually stitch up and like affirm and glue this kind of residuals that come back into some like meaningful and new, like, I don't know, body. So because this is what you get back from whatever tactical like stuff you did, right? And then you on one hand you might be, I don't know, negating something, but on the other hand, what you get back and then you can use is this feedback, which you judge if it's meaningful or useful by your strategy, which is kind of, it sounds like the point, right? Because it's able to evaluate anything that comes back in some simple way. And the consistency of kind of like your collective or the political movement is given of how well you can internally kind of like stitch back this stuff into like a body. I don't know if it
Yeah,
makes sense.
it does. And the strategy also is like really hard to I guess get a grasp on, right? Because it's this like higher order thing that is like the paths through the space that depends on the way you're measuring it too, right? And also the context.
And the strategy is more global, right? And the tactic would be something more singular or local. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, Badu does have the distinction between the body and the organs, right? The organs are local to a point. Like there's one-to-one correspondence between points and organs, whereas the body is kind of the envelope of.
Yeah, actually, I think if I'm not mistaken, just to go over it very quickly. So you have points for him have this, it's just you take a world and you divide it in two, right? So you're assigning parts of the world. So something that belongs to the current world, you're assigning it this either 0 or 1. And he shows that this function, if you have many of these points mapping onto one, right? That they form some topology. Then he defines bodies first. A body is defined by this. You have something that didn't exist in the world has maximal existence. So now you check if other parts of the world, so X, let's say the existence of X, you check if the identity of that part with the trace equals the existence of the thing. So the very existence of the thing, it testifies to its identity with this thing here. And he says that the body for a trace is the set of all x such that this holds. And if this holds, you know that x is small, it's lesser than e by definition. He shows that this is the case. So you get an order where these things are, any x will be compatible with the other, and they all are kind of below e like this, right? Forming this interior that is synthesized by e. But then the organ is, which is the crucial thing, which is if the only thing that gives you this is the trace itself, there is no effectivity. It's like having a strategy that has no tactic to go along with it, right? So he defines, he defines an organ to be a part of the body defined by some point or set of points, such that the synthesis of these points, so for every x, such that this holds, id ex equals, e of x, and x is smaller than another point which is not e, right? Which he writes like this. So you don't simply have, let's say, e and then everything below it, right? You have something like this, e, and then you have something smaller than e, and then x below it, like a regional envelope, right? So only in this case do you have a body, which is this whole thing, C, and organs, which is this smaller thing. So organ, I don't think you can have an organ with many points inside of it. But it needs to be the least larger envelope, which is not the general trace of the event.
Yeah, but I think this is, yeah, you're right. I think organs contain more than one point, but they're still one-to-one with points, because there can be at most one maximal point in the organ, which is kind of its synthesis,
yeah.
Its synthesis point.
I see now. Sorry, it just went into something that had nothing to do with what you were saying.
No, but it's a good, because this is the structure we care about, right? This the decision, when we talk about dividing the world in two, it's like we are dividing, we are finding these points, right? Which then become the basis for each organ.
Yeah.
But it has to be, it's not like a one-time thing you decide and it's over. It's like you need to create a machine that continually treats that point. And I think the learner is a more apt description of that. The learner is like located in one part of the world, trying to learn that part of the world. And I think that corresponds to the point. Like each point is like a context, like Yasha was saying earlier, like each point is a context in which there's certain information local to that point. And a learner lives in that point and continuously tries things, and gets feedback from those experiments.
So yeah, on that idea of the learner, just real quick, and going back to the binary of the point, is that specifically linked to strong change? Like, do you need to have like a fuzzy set if you're trying to evaluate points on weak change and whatnot? Or is that for any kind of point?
I only really fully understood, I think I understood better why Badiou is saying that you have this crazy object built with all these different parts, right? And they're all indexed on this ABC structure, right? Why do you want to map them onto this 1 or 0 thing, right? The reason is it's simply because it's not because novelty is a classical logic thing. I mean, it's even, I realized that, I mean, I think Dennis said this when Pedro and Caron were presenting on Girard and this weird mixture of intuitionism and classic logic that they use, right? But it's more about the fact that, say you have something here that doesn't count, right? I mean, it is there, but it doesn't count. So at the level of being, it is. At the level of what exists in the world, it doesn't count, right? So for example, individual workers count, but the collective of workers doesn't count, something like this. Or there's something about the workers doing things together that doesn't count, right? I think that the point of mapping it classically is simply to, let's say, project the logic back onto the set, right? Because at the level of the set, the thing is there. Like the example that we used a lot last year, like you're playing an instrument and it has some specific timbre, right? Or some specific thing that doesn't count for the music you're making. Like to bring a form out of the multiple, you don't need to add more logic in the sense of make the logic more sophisticated. You actually project the musical space, like you flatten it back onto ontology, right? Because ultimately the thing is there. Like Badiou doesn't want you to make statements about other worlds and say, you know, a new connection between workers is possible. He wants you to extract the connection that is there and do stuff with it, right? So it's so you're kind of inventing a belonging operator on your own, right?
So like looking at that again from the trade union example, like a trade union extracts certain subsets of workers based upon trades, but then an industrial union would be adding a new category of belonging to industrial workers as such that you could then join. Like that would be an actual, that would be mapped to a 0 in the American Federation of Labor and to a 1 in the Congress of Industrial Organization, right? Like that would be the actual shift in what's recognized and organized, would be something like that. Like new subsets that are actualized in society as organizations.
Yeah, it could be like that, right? I mean, I think that we're starting to get the feel that, for example, if you have something that doesn't exist, right? So for example, in the question, does this weird set here belong or not, right? We're saying that, for example, in this world here, x prime and x double prime belong to x, right? Belong, no, but they're relevant parts of x. They exist, right? So this is not really belong, but anyway, they exist in x, right? But this thing here has a very low existence, right? Which Badiou would write like this. This conjunction, the common part of the workers, for example, has no existence, right? What you want to say is that you want to project these things onto some thing like this, and you get to say like, well, x prime, yes, it exists, x also exists, x double prime also exists, and this crazy thing also exists, right? So in that sense, when you did this, you kind of just like you didn't really treat it by a predicate that was recognizable in that world. You just treat it by the predicate to be. It is. This thing is, right? You don't need to know very much about it. It's not like you know what it can do or you know a way to describe it. So it's kind of like borrowing the belonging operation as a predicate. And so that's how I understand why this thing is classical for him. And it makes sense because he needs to be able to treat all these things as points, right? In order to kind of show that forcing is valid in this space, right?
Yeah, the other side of this, which we didn't cover yet, is that this post set is ordered by, I think, implication. So we can think of the points and everything as propositions, and the inexistent, the top thing, is just like your axiom. And then everything that flows down are the consequences from that axiom, right? So if you say this thing exists in the world, which didn't exist before, but now I'm saying this thing exists, everything, all the points below that are the consequences of saying this thing exists. And so that's how I think we can interpret forcing, right? We're forcing new propositions from the inexistent, which considered as a proposition.
When I tried to understand how we could bring this back propagation into this picture, like I went back to being an event because this theory is very weak in logics of worlds, like don't get much kind of detail on it. But in logic, in being an event, you have like the same theory, but as a theory of conditions, right? Which takes like this multiple, and then you want to construct something in it that has that is inconstructible, indiscernible, no predicate can discern it, right? And the way you can kind of approach it is by coming up with those conditions, right? Those kind of chains of information, right? And he makes this constant remark that I think I even have it here. He says, I thought it was very relevant from the perspective of the things we're talking about. Where is it? Here. He says this. That the same thing that like here this statement here I think is the crucial one, when he says that conditions, which are this sort of chains of does it belong or doesn't it belong to the subset we're trying to construct, right? These conditions, they have a double function. They are the material for the subset you're trying to construct, and they are information on the subset, right? So the same thing as you're building this new subset, right? On the one hand, these things will form the material for it. They are internal to it, right? They are the very stuff it's made of, but they're also gathering information about it, which is relevant to the construction, right? Like if you're trying to, for example, if you're trying to build something which is indiscernible, meaning it has no being in the situation, you need to keep very close count of the predicates that can capture the stuff that you already did, right? So, for example, you have a situation where, I think this is actually part of his critique of trade unions, right? That you're starting to organize workers. Well, there is in a company, for example, the fact that there might be, let's say, similar workers means that that set falls under the predicate, for example, I don't know, carpenters, right? So there is something in common to all of them that is already known in the situation. So you could reduce that construction back to this, but that predicate is actually relevant information to further inquiries in the process. So you know that you need in the set something which is not a carpenter, so that it doesn't fall under the predicate, the set of carpenters, right? So on that base, you already get the feeling that what he considers a generic procedure can't really be exhausted by trade unions. simply for the fact that they are pretty much the political version of a predicated subset, right? Trade, predicate, union, like this subset. So you would have to have someone who is not in the same category, and then that falls under a new predicate, and then you need someone else who's then not in any of the two categories you already have. So in that way, it becomes more anonymous the larger that it becomes, right? And you get this kind of feedback between the material, meaning which parts of the situation were included, right? And information, which tells you something about what predicates to contradict, right? So perhaps, like, if you look at it from the perspective of being an event, then it fits a bit better. Like, you have the situation, and you have like parts of the situation, right? And you're going through the question: does it belong to the generic set or not, right? For him, it's like this. And you can add it to this set, right? It starts forming this. But it changes the set and tells you something. Well, now, for example, if the predicate P of S is 1, then you need something some X, such that P of X is 0, right? That doesn't fit in that category. And that tells you something about what you're looking for. You're going to be looking for some other S, right? This would be generic in a simplistic sense. Like, I want to add some material, but the material I add becomes information about what not to add, for example, right? Or about what else to pursue in the inquiry.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would if like the subsets that it picks out are ones that were not included before, right? In like the previous knowledge. So I guess it would have to be something more like related to like the update parameters over time, like the picture where you have the arrows going from the top through as well, right?
The arrow like this, right?
Yeah, when you update the parameters, I mean, for it to be generic, right? Because the genericity is about picking out an infinite subset that was not included in the situation before, right?
Yeah.
So the elements that you would have to pick out to be 1 here, right, would have to not be included in like the previous like loop inside, I suppose.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there's a way that maybe to connect it. I think it's giving me a lot to think about.
Yeah, if you go to the last meditations of being an event, I mean, now I think that this whole discussion of information there, it might be used. But I mean, I'm saying this just because it seems like the theory of points, it is actually conflating material and information, right? Because at one level, when you do this, it's kind of about appearances, right? P's are degrees of appearance, right? So phi of P is, at some level, is about, does this appear connected or not? So it's kind of about information, but at the same time, this is connected with the actual multiples, right? And you are actually recomposing the multiples into a body. So it actually has a material version as well, right? This is info, but this is also a part of some part of A, right? That now is composed into this new thing. So it's also a material for that thing, right? And the point seems to go here, and the whole theory of bodies and organs seems to go here, right? Like the theory of it, will this consist or cohere, right? things like this. So,
And I think to add this to the more like categorical stuff we've been talking about, this almost feels like taking a previous vibration of some sort, which is like objects constructed over a space, and adding like new bundles in that didn't necessarily appear before, right? Because like when they talk about these, like this image of like the bundle, which is like you have points, and then over each point you have some object that's constructed. It doesn't have to be just like this, maybe like basic thing. Like for example, tangent spaces are like the good example. If you think of like some surface, and at each point you have the space which is tangent to it, right? And you add them all together, but those, like each one is kind of separate. But in these, I guess, more complicated constructions, that doesn't have to be the case, right? Things can be glued together in like these bundles. But I don't know, it gives an idea. I think there might be a way to think of this in a more almost like homotopy type theory kind of way, right? These like higher order types above it, and then you have like paths which kind of determine how things work over time. We might be able to connect things, but I don't know yet. Not sure if any of that makes sense.
Yeah, it's complicated because it's, yeah, like we're constantly jumping between the type description, the spatial description, and I would say like the logical or propositional description.
Yeah,
and they're all interconnected, also in a Trinitarian way, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much where I took it from. I mean, we probably could retranslate it, right? These three things in terms of those three things we're talking about, like.
It might be cool to structure things, a lot of these descriptions in these Trinitarian ways, right? Like provide it from three different perspectives, like three different pictures.
Yeah, I wonder how this like compositional kind of knowledge or informational and these interactive things, if they map onto these different viewpoints, you know?
Yeah, I don't know. I have to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the organization seems to map onto, actually, I would say possibly onto spatial, and information can map.
Yeah, I think this maps to types and like programming and stuff, right?
Yeah,
Probably.
interaction of types, maybe. Yeah. Yeah, because it's basically like saying anytime you're deciding whether something belongs to something else, you're also talking about a space that you're constructing, logical space in which some part of that space now is a local version of a larger part. And then, yeah, this thing about bundles can be thought of as the space constructed over a point is like the space which affirms that p degree to be true, so maximal. So like propositionally, there's in the world, in an intuitionistic world, some propositions are neither true nor false. They're somewhere in between, right? And so a point would send some of those propositions that are neither true or false to true. And then you could say, what does the world look like if in that slice of the topos where those propositions are now true, forced to be true, which is interesting. That is like, that gives a nice interpretation to treating a point. Treating a point would be something like now affirming this forcing or affirming that these propositions are now true. Where does that lead you in your next experiment, let's say?
It's interesting because don't you guys think that Badiou ultimately only explores like this is the whole discussion on the greater logic and the transcendental functor. This is the points. This is the formation of the body, but he doesn't really go into this. Right? I mean, this sort of recomposition.
And that would be like the most concrete too, right?
Yeah, this would be actually like you have, this is the, let's say, the tactical version.
Yeah.
This is where the thing that Renzo asked kind of comes in. Like, what does it mean to actually take some object, build in some way with some parts, right? And to actually, I don't know, take this thing and compose it with some other thing that was hidden below it, right?
Yeah. It might be
Yeah.
because of this tactical is kind of maybe like completely context dependent. I don't know. This is like wild
I
speculation.
think for a philosopher, it's probably a good
Yeah.
thing that he didn't go into this. I mean, it's actually quite
Yeah.
beautiful to see the whole thing like set up for this to be kind of an experiment, right? This is where
I
the
think that's probably
experiment-
what he would say.
Yeah, I hope that, I think that's the good answer. The bad answer is that he was just lazy.
Yeah.
But I think this is where the experiment comes in, right?
I
You have a
agree.
sort of question of, does it belong? Right? You have this sort of, does it cohere? But this sort of interactive, like, how does it change, right? Or how is it recomposed?
Yeah, reorganizes also.
Yeah. I think this is the sort of aspect that we're looking for, because this would be the perspective of the information we were talking about. This is kind of the perspective of the composition, the ultimate composition of the thing. How did it end up composed, right? But this is kind of the how does it interact perspective, right? So in a certain sense, you have like something from A, and you want to put it as part of a body, right? This is the experiment part. And you have some parameters, which can come, for example, from decisions you already made and from the general coherence of already exists. And these experiments might change this body in some sense, right? No, something like that. I mean, I feel like this for now is just so vague. Most of that part, you know, but I do think that it's something that I at least like the fact that it makes a clear connection between. I mean, it's something that it makes sense that it's not even in logics of worlds, but the way that I understood it thus far is that this category, right? I think it's like optic. It's not even. It's a dual category, right? In the sense that
I think it's on any symmetric monodal category. I believe,
yeah,
right?
because
Which is very general.
Yeah, it's just in the sense that you have, let's say, a category objects in a category C going this way, and to other objects in it, and you have this update function and other things going to objects in the same category. But the parameters, they're actually coming from this different category, right? So this would be like, say, a parameter M, and this is a parameter N, for example. That's why this is the weird thing about it, because then when you're composing objects in these two categories at the same time. So like you're adding something that is not, it's not reducible to the objects of the first one, right? That's why it's called para-optic, parametrized optics, right?
Yeah, but that's also how allows it to change itself, right?
Yeah. I mean, the thing that is changing, it's the only thing I wanted to mention is that it's combining changes to objects in one category, changes to objects in another category, which is not reducible to that one, right? Like the space of this is the space of possible parameters. And the space of this is the space of certain objects, right? Both of them are symmetric monoidal in the sense that this is how you can compose them together, in fact, right?
Yeah.
But they're not reducible to one another. It's an added feature.
So in one of the essays you sent out, Gabriel, they refer to that residual as like a traversal dimension across the optic itself, like that it's a separate category of residual, I think, M.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that could be used as ways of thinking about like traversing different economic worlds or exchange worlds, that there's, because the parameter we can conceive of in higher order types is like you were saying, like ways of looking at things, right? So would the parameters be what traverses different worlds, or is it the other way around? Are those different ways of looking at things?
I think the parameters would traverse different consequences for that structure, right? So it's like, I mean, the example, I'm thinking of this from like the machine learning perspective a lot of the time, right? So that's like what like the gradient descent is there. So there's some measure on the space on like what it means for the model to be successful.
Yeah.
And then you the parameters give you basically like a point in that space when you add in the actual like inputs, and then you can use that to experiment based on what like how you're doing in whatever your, I guess, like measurement space is. So it depends. There's a lot of like context dependent things.
Sure.
Yeah,
sure.
The path is in the parameter space. Yeah.
So it's something more constrained than like a whole world. We're dealing with a very kind of specific set of operations then.
Yeah, I think the division, like the parameter space, is like how the organization almost like thinks or is structured, right?
I think this
It's
is
what
what
can be
Badiou calls.
changed.
Yeah, I think Badiou calls it the subject language, right?
Yeah, yeah.
For example, you use a kind of provisory language to talk about the stuff you're doing. But as you do stuff, you might increment that language. I mean, it's not just the stuff being composed, but it's a kind of parameter for how you're doing these inquiries, how you're composing stuff, right? So it is kind of a slightly extrinsic thing, right?
But without the full kind of step away of like a meta language, it's much more embedded in.
Yeah, I think that
operations.
That's why he says like, well, it's an important component for him in generic procedures that you can kind of anticipate in a kind of fictional way this infinite set of consequences of these inquiries, right? The set is impossible to construct. It's an infinite procedure, but you have a language in which, for example, the revolution is happening, right? That's not only, let's say, a name for a thing in the world. It is also a tactical and kind of strategic view of what matters and what doesn't, right? Perhaps in that sense, we could imagine it as a sort of added kind of enrichment of this process that brings together a sort of provisory idea of what matters and what doesn't, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, perhaps it's something like that. I'm not really sure how to.
Yeah, that blog post talks about it in terms of like internal state, interiority, right? The M is like the space of what can be retained.
Yeah.
So, and these are like, for the ML comparison, these are like hyperparameters. These are what you're putting as like your overall constraints.
Yeah, I think it's both the learning algorithm and the hyperparameters, right?
Oh, it's all of them. Okay.
But yeah, but pursuing the machine learning thing, I was thinking, it's because there's this kind of like the interface part, which is the way in which you kind of like send some question or some data point. So the do would be, you can interpret it as some form of like data point, you want to know the answer, and then you get some sort of either like the answer or to the question, or some error signal, right, that you use to update. So on the side of the X, you would have what's like and in this sense is that I think it's also related to the difference between information and material, because you have the kind of like the dimensionality of the model that of your own internal model, right? So you receive a certain like signal, and you're able to update your internal model based on your material capacity to represent this new information, right? So
Exactly, yeah.
But in a sense, the kind of like structure you learn, and according to your capacity to like code, like say you're a small network with like 3 parameters, and you're trying to modeling a really rich world. So you're constrained by your own internal, the dimensionality of your model, right? But
Yeah, I think that's why they use the term residual, because the residual is like,
Makes a lot of
it's like a
sense.
poor version of the signal that is being passed around.
Yeah.
You only capture residual amount of information from the signals going back and forth.
yeah.
Yeah, the way that
That makes
I'm
sense.
thinking of this, how I would like think of this for what we're doing, I think this is the place where, let's say, cognitive mapping comes in. You know, in the sense that you're doing things, but you're kind of also constructing a poorer version of the space you're acting on, right? And based on what you're on the reaction of these actions, you get a better or worse feel to if that kind of mapping makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the M is your cognitive mapping, and then if you add more to it, if you enrich that space, then you're able to differentiate more the information that's coming back. And actually, it's both, right? What you can
That
do,
makes sense.
what you can do becomes more differentiated as well, and what comes back becomes more differentiated.
Mhm.
Yeah, the mapping is how you interpret the information that comes in, right?
So isn't it also the
Oh, and
Because this
output, right?
pair of the M shows up in the codomain of do, so it's taking some X.
Yeah, M
to,
appears both places, right? M appears, do is like this, right? It takes X to M Y, and propagate takes R times M to S, right? So it appears on the here and here. Right, this is an output here, in fact, and it is an input here, right? So this is like
so
this.
if M is like a knob, then you're outputting some residual from your action that's saying like, when I did this action, my knob was turned to 2. And then when the data comes back, you're saying, oh, I know that my knob was turned to 2 when the system gave me a feedback. Now I'm going to compute this payoff or loss function.
Yeah,
knowing-
but it's not just the knob, right? It's also the choice of like measuring stick or like all these other the internal, I guess, logic of how like the experimentation is judged, right? And those are ultimately like in some sense value judgments. But it's like, I'm just trying to say it's more than just the parameters, right? It's just a knob turning. So if it's like that analogy, it's the knob plus the internal mechanism that like the knob respects, right?
I see.
The knob is like the parameter. You can change the parameter based on whatever inputs and outputs, but the choice of how like you measure what inputs and outputs are bad or keep, or how you react to them, that is like a whole thing. Like for example, in machine learning, like at least today, there's you always choose different algorithms for like how you essentially like do the gradient descent, right? And that's a choice, and there's like certain like steps, and you can have like momentum where you try to generally keep going in the same direction. Those are all ultimately choices of like strategy in some sense. So I think that's like all of that stuff, all that info together is, and I think connecting to like the cognitive mappings, like your previous cognitive mappings as Sheaves paper, it makes this I think make a lot of sense, because then you can think of it as a sheaf over this just like empty actor, right? That does something but doesn't necessarily like have a strategy, and then the mapping is how it thinks of the world and the strategy, right?
Yeah, how it thinks of the world and its own actions
Yeah,
in a way,
I
because
think that
when you make the action, you're tying it to some internal state. Like, yeah, I mean, just in the concept of gradient descent, it seems like in order to do gradient descent, you have to locate
Yes.
yourself in some smooth, like differentiable space, right?
yeah, exactly. And that's just an example of this. It's not
Yeah, they have a,
Right.
an example of an adversarial network here with this backpropagation thing. Just to see what they consider part of it.
So here it would be more complicated, because there would be like two strategy, because there's two
Yeah,
actors and they work against each other, right? There's one that judges the other, and there's one that does the actual acting.
yeah. So but the parameter space, right? It's, I just want to see what they consider the actual parameters.
Oh yeah, I mean the parameters, I mean concretely are just like basically like the scales on each of
Just the weights and
possible
everything.
input values, just the weights and everything. Yeah, the weights and biases generally, but it can be, just you can just think of it as just like a list of numbers generally.
Yeah. So the
Structured
actual
in some way.
wiring in your neural network, that's just in the that's in one category, and then the weights are in this parameterizing. category.
Yeah, the weights are like the parameters that go in the up and down ones in the object, right?
Okay.
And the wiring is the actual like structure itself. And then this M that goes on itself is like the loss function, basically, which is how you judge how you're doing in the world.
And where is it here? They have a
Like,
yeah.
like for a business, it could be like profit, right? For example. So it could be applied to a lot of things.
Yeah, I think this is their basic description, right? So parameterized optics models cybernetic systems, dynamical systems steered by one or more agents. Then this weird symbol, I don't know how to pronounce it, represents agency being exerted on systems, which is these these compositions here, the ones on the vertical axis, I think. On the horizon, yeah, no, the actors are on the vertical axis, right? And systems are on the horizontal ones.
So does this imply that for any organization, regardless of how effective M is, there is some M operative that we can model, or we can like quantify or something.
I think it would be like how it judges itself, right?
Judges itself. So it's not necessarily all the information we're using. Okay.
It's like it's what I think the best way to interpret this is what it does with its experimentation, like, or how it interprets it.
It's kind of each
So it can be very
organization's
complicated,
specific
right?
take on experimental method, kind of like how it goes about learning.
Yeah, and they can each be very different, and like we have, I feel like, very little clue about what that actual structure is, right?
Yeah, because it seems like you can change things in 2 dimensions. You can actually change the optics side, which is like composing, adding more learners of different types to the thing to make it a bigger learner. But then you can also change the parameter space. And that, what they call that, like reparameterization, which I guess is a common term, but
okay, yeah.
So like you were saying, how you represent the world. How, I think Renzo, you were saying like how the means that you have to represent the world or the cognitive mapping can be changed, and that would be corresponding to the reparameterization.
Yeah, for example, just to give an idea, like imagine you have, okay, you have this world and you have some, I think we were talking about this, Renzo, perhaps this is a good way to bring one of the questions that I had into view, which was, let's say you have a bunch of objects in this world and you're trying to organize, let's say, a protest, right? And therefore, you're going to combine a bunch of aspects of that world, parts of the world, like people from different parts of the city or parts of the workforce and so on, and they're going to do something, right? And you get the protest. So you have, let's say, people here in this world, and here you have the sort of protest. And the protest has some composition of people who went, and it has some class composition, it has some size, many things can be relevant, right? And I think that the question that I was asking last time is, how do you define which is the parameter through which you can tell if something had success or not? Like, it's not imminent to, I mean, it can become more imminent the more it becomes the very principle of composition. So for example, if you're concerned with having a heterogeneous class composition, right? You do the protest, you realize that that particular strategy brought a lot of different people to the protest, not only, let's say, the academic leftists. Now you know that you can insist on that kind of strategy to further that aspect of it, right? But at first, that parameter is kind of extrinsic because there are many different things to assess the protest. Like, you might have 10,000 people, but they're all pretty much from the same kind of social class. Like, you need some added thing to tell you that this is, what is the value of this, right? Like, is this a success or a failure, for example? You cannot be, it's not intrinsic to the protest itself or just to the composition of it that this is decided, right? So
yeah, I see. I think I would put it on the side of this kind of like representational capacity that was.
Yeah,
so
it makes a lot of sense to me.
So you can imagine like you have the real like manifold of the actual like richness of this thing, but you don't have access to it. But internally you have like your internal manifold where you can like you can actually parameterize stuff that you measure. So in your internal like organization, you could be able just to see like you're organizing in an electoral way. So your electoral logic allows you to see like certain tendencies that has implications for like who gets elected in a certain thing. But all of that is kind of predefined by this kind of like finite and reduced manifold on which you can actually assess the interventions and effects, right? So you would have on one hand your kind of ability to, based on the interventions you make, discernible interventions, you register discernible effects, but all that would be already kind of like, in a sense, kind of limited by your internal organizational space, or right, something like that. But at the same time, the fact that you were effective in kind of like modeling, there's like some form of like mutual information between your interventions and your effect, means that your model still captures something real about the world, right? Because it's so in this sense, like the geometry of your model must account for something real in the geometry of the data, like outside there. That's
that makes sense to me, like because what I think we're starting to get a feel for is that when you don't have this sort of transcendental, like, which already tells you what you're aiming for, and I think that Karatani has this, and we're trying to avoid it, but in a certain way, Badiou kind of takes the question out of the table as well, because the problem of how you see the world differently is not really the sort of communist hypothesis, the quality sometimes substitutes the problem of, okay, what sort of representational power do you have to assess the things you're doing? Like that usually doesn't appear in his example so much. So when you reduce this just to this local thing, and the global thing is up for kind of construction, right? There is a gap between, let's say, I have the impression, the gap between what kind of you can compose locally in terms of what a political process manages to gather together, and this added conditions that we have because we're concerned with larger processes, and Badiou is not, that you need to add so that you can start talking about, let's say, cohesion, not at the level of eternity, which I think is what he's worried about. Like, eternity solves that problem for you, right? Things are transhistorically available. So you don't need to have a working representation of it to continue. It's already going to be there just because it happened, right? Whereas for us, if this kind of slow increasing cohesion requires you to think about, okay, what sort of way of understanding what's going on can be shared, for example, between protests here and a strike there, or this sort of tactics and some other very different process that happening there, right? That there's something mediating these things to allow you to talk about the sort of non-localized coherence of the body that I think Badiou doesn't really address. So I think that this idea that we might need the theory of points needs to come together with a sort of almost like a pragmatic transcendental, right? It's a fake transcendental, sort of fake representation of totality. You don't get that in his theory, right?
Yeah, from the conversation on synergy and stuff, I was imagining if it was possible to like kind of start with a really small transcendental that you kind of like actually kind of glue with stuff that you are able to kind of recover and obtain. And I don't know if it's, but yeah, for me, it also like what's kind of like intrigues me is exactly this passage from tactics to strategy in kind of like the practical way in which something that's kind of like singular and local is able to kind of compose something that is kind of stable. So it's kind of this passage from action, like political action, to political organization.
Mhm.
This, right? So it's this
Yeah.
movement.
I was
Because
even thinking if we shouldn't add like to this kind of diagram, like isn't there perhaps for us a line that doesn't exist for Badiou? Like Badiou, here you have like degrees related to parts of the world, and he's only concerned with one body, and therefore like the whole dialectics is between decisions and the construction of this body, right? But in a certain sense, we could call this, let's say, a situated, or let's say we could call this a political body, but we also wanted, like, we want there to be something like this new perspective, right? This new transcendental, which has many bodies, like almost like it has not a political body, but a political economical body, right? Like you have a whole ecology of different things going on, and there should be some global coherence possible to what they're doing, right? So it's like this is a part of this political economic larger thing, right? And this thing here is actually a local version of what this thing here is, right? And this seems to be tactics, and this seems to be strategy, sort of thing.
yeah, but couldn't the organ, if you substitute the
Like put organ here and body here,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
but
Yeah,
I'm
maybe
not
that
sure.
already works, yeah. But
Yeah, because that fits compositionally, right? Because you have this arrow now, which is the original arrow, and you're saying that there's an intermediate step.
And
Yeah.
I think it's nice, this scheme, because then there's also the problem between the kind of like negative interface with the world, with the transcendental of the world, and then the sort of
more positive, right?
positive, affirmative, constructive part of, which
Yeah.
would be kind of like the interior of the movement, and but
Mhm.
it's completely conditioned also by this interfacing exteriority to the world.
Yeah. No, this is nice, yeah. Yeah, what I think is perhaps a bit, I mean, Badiou doesn't talk about this very much, but you have this idea that you have some trace, right? And you have these smaller traces, which are the organs, right? So these are the synthetic points that are more local, right? And then you have this global, more general synthetic power. The only perspective, the whole thing seen from the perspective of the trace, right? The reason why I would be unclear as to whether this is the right diagram, or if even if we do keep these two things, we shouldn't have a third thing, is because I have the impression that here is still zero, right? It's still like the definition of the body is that it is a kind of singular part of the world. You know, like the way Badiou describes the body ultimately is the set of those consequences that require you to take this as existing to claim that they're real implications, right? So you would only say this thing exists, or this thing happened, or this thing is true if you consider this to be true as well, right? And the organs are smaller things that make all of these things true. Only these things true, right? And this other organ makes only these things true. And the eventual trace, or the body, is the thing you need to consider to make these whole connections true, right? I'm not sure yet if it is simply a matter of saying, well, we came up with a very complicated theory of the eventual trace for social formations because they need to avoid an economic kind of capture under commodity or value, meaning that they will be, if they're not seen by value communities or states they will be pretty delocalized or decentralized. So the body will also be of that form, right? A sort of, so I'm not sure if it's just a matter of the quality of the trace that already points us to something that Badiou didn't study simply because of the sort of world we're studying, or if there needs to be some other idea here that is correlating to the idea that there is actually a new dominating transcendental, you know, a sort of something which is not simply part of the world that is not visible, but is formally, that is informing what we do, but actually a whole way of looking at the world as in general that is new. I'm not sure if those two things are the same, you know, or if this is something else is needed here to make this. Like, should we have something like a definition of economy here, you know, as a sort of, or an ecology or whatever, which has many of these things inside, or is it just a matter of scaling the body up and therefore the organs are also larger structures? It doesn't change it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Because somehow it seems to me that like points are here, and this is our, let's say, also connected with points, right? But the thing we just talked about, like the sort of world picture that you can have, right? The way you localize yourself in the world, the way that you situate everything from within the thing you're doing. I wonder if that's not this added thing here, you know, some sort of parameters that take you from those decisions to a certain picture of the world, you know? And then you also get something that is slightly different here, but I'm not sure if this is just total craziness or if it's actually adding relevant stuff.
You think it makes sense to connect that move of M with what you were talking about a couple weeks ago, with the kind of like rethinking that part by Marx in the manifesto around communism as like a position rather than like a person or an entity? Like that there's a position that we need to construct, and that is the same position from which this kind of parameterized feedback comes through.
Yeah, it's a good question, because I mean, I don't want to overdo what's in that, like overinterpret what's in that passage. Actually, I lost where it is. Yeah, I had it here. So yeah, like what he's saying here, right?
Because in a weird kind of way,
because there was this weird passage in it.
When we're like with those diagrams, it almost seems like a formal, non-substantive idea of like, quote, socialism coming from the outside. But instead of it being like a class sense, like, oh, petty bourgeois intellectuals have to yada yada, it's like literally like a perspective that is communist or socialist, is this thing that is kind of like looping back and helping construct the feedback loop itself in a weird kind of way. But like, just like parameters, like Yasha were saying, are also choices. Like, it's not just turning dials. There are always kind of political choices in that process or something.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that there's something there. I'm really unsure on how to follow it. Like, perhaps we should be cautious, not like trying to add more stuff before we know how to deal with the stuff we have. But either way, like, it seems like why isn't the eraser working? It seems like there is something to this thing that makes some, I don't know, it seems to me that, for example, when you're talking about just what Badiou is proposing, right? So just going back to that simpler version, like in this construction here, you where would you put, like, how would you divide inside of it this three parts we were talking about, right? There is something here that is changing how you compose things, right? So you're trying to reorganize things. There is something about you could reinterpret this also, like in terms of interaction. Perhaps we could find a way. Like, I don't think it would require us changing anything. And in a certain sense, he does suggest that, well, this becomes a perspective from which you see the rest of the world, right? Because it's a divided perspective. You see things in antagonistic terms. Things are redescribed with new value of appearance. So perhaps it also already has this intelligibility kind of value. So I'm not sure if you need like a new concept to sorry, my screen totally froze. But I'm not sure if you need a new kind of element to the construction to hold this idea that, okay, this interactive thing is also making something intelligible, and or taking some new information that didn't matter is now it matters, and this depends on the way that it's composed. It might all be there. It just needs to be refined rather than expanded, you know, like more than needing an added operation, you just need to kind of find the right constraints for the thing. I'm not really.
Yeah, no, I think that latter makes more sense to me, that there's something kind of like, you're not actually adding anything. It's a way of kind of looking at the logical structure in a, I don't know, generic or productive way without bringing anything new to the content.
Yeah, because I mean, the thing that already makes everything more complicated for me is that, let's say, when we talk about composition in a world where objects have this multi-layered structure, which is something Badiou doesn't talk about, you're saying that for every recomposition, you're affecting its commodity, its value indexing, its community indexing, its legal indexing, right? So you might be coming up with a non-governmental organization, or you might be doing something illegal, or you might be doing something that has some stakes on elections, for example, representative stakes. You might be kind of dissolving a community because of its asocial kind of characteristics, or you might be forming a community, right? You might be devaluing some assets, or you might be creating something that has value, right? So there is the destiny of all those indexes that you need to see. At the same time that you were conditioning all of this into saying that it's not enough for things to acquire new values on the three layers that already exist. They need to acquire value. They need to acquire some new appearing that's only recognizable from the movement or from the body or so on, right? So like this fourth condition, that it has some level of negation or some level of partitioning away from the world, right? Like, I think that in that way, we're able to talk about, let's say, social movements being movements that reindex things on the already existing transcendentals. It's a social formation and a social movement. Then you can discern from social movement something that is, let's say, locally political, in the sense that it does create something that is only kind of intelligible from the perspective of a political process. The question that still is very obscure is, well, we want to talk about the process of doing this in such a way that that it also appears how political processes can compose together. I think that's a good way of putting it, right? It's not only enough to ask the question, does something new appear because of a political process? I think the added question we're making is, how do parts of a political process appear to each other, right? That's when you turn the question into a question of a new transcendental in any way. Like compositional dimension of many political kind of strains, right? Or even the composition between its parts, taking it not as a given, and it's clear why we cannot take as a given in comparison with Badiou. For Badiou, if you're breaking with the transcendental, it's already something else. But in our case, you can break with a transcendental layer and not break with the other. So there's still a problem of how do you feature these connections, right? So at that level, I think that doing whatever Badiou was doing in terms of points and decisions and organs in a way that makes more explicit the problem of composing these things together, it's something that is not there, right? Because that's a problem that's a problem that goes a bit beyond, let's say, situated intervention, right? I think.
Yeah, there's composition which doesn't have generative effects. There's composition that does have generative effects. I think that's also a distinction, because you can compose two things that really can operate independently. Don't really they don't contradict each other, but they also don't really add anything to one another. But then I would guess we're also interested, or more interested, in these compositions which produce a bigger effect than the parts, right?
Yeah.
Like you said, imagine you have like three movements, like, I don't know, anti-racist movement, movement for universal healthcare or something like that, and then another movement for, I don't know, better care of the elderly. These are three more or less independent movements. So when we say, okay, composition, what does that mean?
Yeah, we're not talking. I think we could discern exactly as you said. Like one thing would be simply the bundling of movements, right? Which is totally extrinsic to say, see all of these movements, they're all part of this leftist front, right? I think that would be a good distinction between leftist composition and communist composition. Leftist composition is when you simply claim they're all the left, like if you put them all together, they'll kill each other, but it's all part of the left. And the issue is, okay, but how do you make it so that you're actually composing the processes in a way that it's not trivial, right? They don't remain what they are.
Exactly, yeah.
And I think that the moment that you take into consideration that this implies that this situated kind of slicing of the world from the standpoint of a given body, right, which is singular, and now you need it to be coherent with another, right? I think that makes a better case for why there is something about how these things are parameterized, right? Or how they think about what they're doing that needs to be synced up or made compatible, not only local interventions, right?
Exactly, yeah. It might turn out that there are some interactive things where, in order for one movement to succeed, it needs to support the other one. If one movement is to succeed, it might need to deprioritize the other one. Then you have internal conflicts. But this is where the difficult questions arise.
So if we're looking at these things compositionally, like taking an old example, like a communist international, like what do you call like that kind of excess infrastructure that you build when you compose things? Is that just part of the composition, or is that an object that comes out of composing previous things, but it's a new object?
But for example, I think a good example is this. I remember Dennis brought this up when we were studying logics of worlds. Like, let's say you have this eventual trace, right? And you have, let's say here, some organ. Inside this organ, you can have many consequences. Then you have here a different organ. And it might be the case that they don't share anything in common but the eventual trace. And you have this huge branching out here, you know, and this other huge branching out. So they're almost totally disjunct. So from the standpoint of this, everything you see is actually disjunct in consequences from everything you see from here, you know?
Mhm.
Like, so you can get like quasi-independent branches of this process, I think. So it's quite interesting, the idea that, for example, which is not necessarily the case. For example, they could share something here, right? And in this case, even though this covers this and this covers this, you can't really totally split them apart. Whereas there are situations where they have nothing common but what's on top of them, right?
Yeah.
And this could be totally split. So for example, imagine this is a scientific endeavor, and this is an experiment which is kind of made possible or becomes an interesting experiment due to that new theory. But all its assumptions and its results are separate from the assumptions and results of this different experiment, you know? They might even be in certain conflict in a way. I mean, it can be the case where this experiment includes this consequence and this includes this consequence, and you need to make a decision, you know? So there is interesting structure to evaluate inside this bodily structure. It can have, I mean, Badiou doesn't talk about this, right? For example, how about we differentiate this, right? Organs that share things with different organs, like they have some conjunction, right? And organs that are totally disjunct but enveloped by something in common, right? So for example, within the international, you can have these two types of international. One that simply kind of includes parties that collect a bunch of consequences, but none of the consequences have anything in common, right? Or you can have a bunch of parties that actually share stuff in common, or organizations that share something in common, and that are enveloped by something larger. Like, so this envelope here in one case is also enveloping a common part here, and a different one might be enveloping things that have nothing in common.
Yeah, and I would say like maybe intersectionality is a good name for that when they do share something in common, right? That
Yeah, I mean,
different movements can actually, they should be non-trivially composed together.
Yeah, I think that's a good example of what we were talking about in terms of composition that is generative, or right, makes this subset here appear, right? Something in common, for example. I mean, I'm just trying to say that. Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could go the other direction and say like the dissolution of the Second International. I know I'm honing on that, but like that's when all the subparts kind of become so different or antagonistic that like that perspective breaks down. That there's something when the internal composition starts to take the other components of the internal composition is no longer belonging to the same eventual trace or the same.
Yeah, because yeah, it's true. Like this, let's say this is, I mean, ultimately we would have to have something like this, like the communist hypothesis here. And then let's say one of the big things about it is the Second International. And then inside the Second International, you have like party 1, you have party 2, you have party 3 in different places. Then inside of this party, there is a set of consequences. And 1, 2, and consequence 3 in party 2 actually clashes with consequence 2 in party 1, right?
Yeah.
And then
you need, important because
then you need to let go of the envelope of these two things. Like this cannot hold anymore, right? But if there's other things here, like some nation and some other thing here, they might hold, and this is dropped.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it really puts a constraint on bodies, right? Because there needs to be some coherence, which is not just imagined by the various groups or organizations. It has to actually cohere in some definite way, right?
Yeah, I think that this is the novel. Perhaps this is the novelty that we're talking about. Like, what the difference I think in our proposition perhaps is that rather than having simply, let's say, for example, below the Communist Party, you have an organization, and here you have a different organization, and here you have a different one, and then below them you have many others, or something like this, right? When we talk about how do we include something economic into the picture, or how do we treat the economy as an organization, you're trying to include a form of, I mean, it's kind of like we're trying to shift away from directly like it's taking me back to what Renzo was talking about with the meme structure and the sort of move from actors to actions, right? I mean, there's something about a sort of economic perspective on politics, or looking for what's common in a slightly different way, which is not necessarily indexed by organizations, right? That might be where the difference is. Like, for example, in the case of a capitalist world, right? It's not simply that you have something like big company here and then small companies here, and it's a relation between companies, right? You have something which is a form that sees everything, right? Which is money. And you can have like top 50s Forbes lists or whatever. Like it's a different way of, I have the impression that it's trusting something else to give you the coherence of this world. It's not really trusting, it's not trusting organizations in the sense of groups of people as the basis of what is being indexed, right? It's indexing value or indexing legal relations, right? So it seems to me that ultimately we don't want like, it's kind of like a balance between finding the right thing about cooperation and about communist organization to serve as the coherence principle, and something which is not, let's say, coherence between ideologies or coherence between I don't know how to say this, like coherence between political principles or something, right? Like it seems to me that when we talk about, let's find something like an impersonal point of view that evaluates, let's say, increasing connectivity between people or something like that. You're trying to find a measure for what counts as relevant consequences that is slightly different, right? So perhaps having that kind of hypothesis is also the thing that makes this less unstable, because right now it seems okay. Like if you have a party one here and it has two consequences with this thing here, and they are contradictory somehow, right? That this whole part here is suddenly inconsistent, unless, of course, I mean, the idea is that you need to find some smaller consequence perhaps that they can agree on, right? And drop both of these.
This seems to be where the reversibility questions and irreversibility come in, because in capitalism, it can take antagonisms and generate new information and new novelty out of that.
Yeah.
And our antagonisms, we all know where those go.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a good point. Yeah.
But that makes a lot of sense. Like thinking of it in the more Bogdanovian kind of way of organization, that when we're looking at capital, we're not talking about a specific organization of specific individuals, but we're talking about a much more real but abstract organization of that's ultimately not even apparent to us as individuals, right? Because we're looking at it in terms of commodities appearing to commodities. Does that imply that we need like a non, like, is this where like the kind of humanist, anti-humanist critique comes into a certain level? Like, we shouldn't be thinking of communism as localized on individuals ultimately, because that's not where it appears, because that's the kind of breakthrough.
I have the impression that it is connected with that, like the idea. I mean, it goes back to that idea, the difference between actors and actions. Like, you kind of want to see the coherence of actions, not the coherence of actors, right? Something like that.
I think what's really nice about this theory of of the memes with force is that because there's this first step of this first condition on the meme that is exactly this kind of like finding a form of producing some form of homogeneity between peoples through this kind of like you just have this empty form in which is kind of indifferent to the pre-existing identities of the actors, right? So it's a form of anyone can take this. It's the mere repetition of this gesture that is flexible, and it brings homogeneity in the sense that it just formally, right? But it has to be sufficiently also like
Sure.
It reminds me a bit about the distinction between what happened?
Sorry, you wanted to use the board. I was a bit confused. If you want,
I was drawing just on top of you.
Sorry.
It reminded me a bit of that difference in the formalism between you have like something like this, right? So in this, in the formalism of this Rosas and Mediano of integrated information, they distinguish between synergy, which would be when two elements you have synergy and redundancy on one side, right? Redundancy would be when two parts share something in common, which is redundant, and synergy would be when you cannot say predict their behavior just by considering them by themselves. So it seems that this idea of the meme is kind of it's able to bundle and produce this kind of homogeneity just by this empty form, and then through action, through practice, it's able to composition in this kind of like generative way. And I don't know, and while in the second form of redundancy, you already knew what was common, right? You already have a shared sense of what you already had. So there's nothing new here, right? Because and that in this sense, I feel like the actors are here, and the kind of this kind of like composition, synergetic actions are on this side, something like that.
Yeah, it makes a lot of, I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me, though. I mean, for example, if we just translate this to our original idea, imagine this is like a factory, and you have a worker 1 and you have a worker 2, right? We had that idea that the collective workers kind of fits this way, right? You can think about this, and there would be some sort of, as you said, like something synergistic about this, right?
Yeah.
So, but at this point, I think that what we're saying is that giving this thing that ultimately doesn't directly exist, like it's not indexed on any, it doesn't exist as a commodity, nor as a community, nor as a legal instance, that's already like that comes in at the sort of finding, let's say, I would put it like this. These arrows here, they have this sort of compositional aspect. In our little schema before, they would go like from taking something from like this factory floor, right? This LP that belong here, and taking the set of them and indexing it on something and calling it whatever, right? Yeah. The strike of a couple of workers. And this belongs to this body, right? And it exists. And then the problem, what you're talking about, this homogenization, is how does this cohere with, for example, what happened in another factory or in a different workplace here, where this delivery guy 1 and delivery guy 2, right? A similar thing happens here. Then you're also so this is some phi here, right? And this is some phi as well. Mm-hmm. And this is left open, okay? But how do you make the two compatible? And for Badiou, the explanation of compatibility between points or compatibility between organs is given by if this is smaller than this and this is smaller than this, and these are real syntheses, it's guaranteed that they are compatible amongst each other. So he would write, let's say, if this is E1 and this is 2, he would write it like this, right? Compatible if and only if blah, 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 blah. 1, 2 smaller than E. But it's I think in our case, I mean, I'm just saying this to show that it seems that both in the case of the meme, like the case of the meme is it's already trying to suggest that there's something about the very kind of lack of something that we usually expect that is the very source of the homogeneity, right? It is giving it a more, let's say, it's treating this thing here more as a form than as a statement, a common statement, for example, or a common perspective, right? I think here you would have this sort of meme event, right? Like it's just a form. It's not necessarily, which goes back to what we were talking about, right? Depending on what constitutes this enveloping principle. If it's, let's say, a statement, it's very easy for it to be inconsistent because you just need it to envelope a contradictory statement to make it inconsistent, right? Or a principle. If you find a good way to think about this in a very emptied out way, the easier it is for other things to fit here that are very heterogeneous as well, right? So there is a sort of
which in some sense it's opposite to the logic of like convergence of struggles, in which you're actually trying to find something common by just looking at what was in a sense already there, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a sort of,
it's weird because this sort of lattice in Badiou, if I'm not mistaken, it's better seen in the inverse, right? This is actually at the bottom and these things are on top, like in terms of, this is like something that didn't exist, that is totally a sort of formal principle. And these things, the more you go on top, you're actually getting like a meatier appearance of it, right? This is maximally appearing, but it is kind of this anonymous common element, right?
Yeah, I would say from the world as it is.
Yeah, this is how it looks like, right?
This is how it looks from the standpoint of the event or whatever. It's the top one.
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing that I'm trying to find, which I think that this, neither Badiou nor the meme, in fact, do, is like, none of them make more explicit the idea that there is something. I mean, for Badiou, it's hidden below the idea that this, I mean, if I understand it correctly, the sort of intelligibility counterpart of the informational counterpart is kind of hidden. Like you have this and a sort of transcendental functor to this, right? And you have this sort of decision structure and the body here. And the connection between these two things here is what concerns you looking at the world in a different way, I think. And the meme, like the whole thing we were talking about, like not letting go of the idea that there is a connection, like moving from intelligibility as capture, right, to intelligibility as an inner aspect of a movement, right? I didn't read the second part. I'll just save it here. But in Badiou, I have the impression that this intelligibility is everything we have on it is just this sort of inner structure of points and organs, right? The fact that you get to tell about a certain ordering of parts based on how they're being composed in this space, right? But not much more than that. And in the meme example, it seems like the main aspect, the main focus of the description is to shed away a bad theory of intelligibility.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I think there's this. It's, I mean, the political perspective there is really like negative in this sense, but maybe the most affirmative part is this kind of looking for forms that produce some sort of homogeneity that kind of binds action together. And he also brings this concept of places of life, sites of life, which is so in the case of, for example, the yellow vest would be for example, the roundabouts. But it's, again, it's maybe it lacks what we're looking for, right? But it's the place where there is where life and everyday life and the pre-existing forms of everyday life, which he calls anti-political forms, which are like mutual aid networks, all sorts of pre-existing kind of like forms of everyday life that are kind of mobilized to make a space. And what's the stake in those spaces? For example, the blockades, it's kind of offensive power of, like actually blocking and interrupting, but also reproducing the kind of like social reproduction aspect of the movement itself, which is something he doesn't reduces to the meme. It's kind of like, but I mean, I think there are quite some limits in the text, like, because when he tries to go more like to describe of like positively what's happening in those spaces, he kind of like goes back to kind of like it's this personal experience, this kind of new sensibility of the individuals and gets really like mapped into the kind of like individual and on kind of like concrete experience and non-mediation, which is quite limited, I think.
Yeah, but it's interesting because, for example, I'm reading the text here, and he tries to oppose leading subjects to leading gestures, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's already a good idea because it shows that, let's say, the atom of politics is a sort of action, and you compose those actions rather than the atom is, let's say, the individual. But I think that the problem that I think it's interesting there is that if you go, for example, back to Bogdanov, his point is well, people trust leaders, or these things are not simply because they're doing bad politics. It's because when things grow in size, that's what's phenomenologically relevant in most societies. So the idea that you look at an individual and his example to see the whole, right, is not simply a bad idea. It's usually what's most phenomenologically extensive as a point of view, right? What a person can tell you about what's going on sometimes is more rich than what you can see just by trying to look at the gesture. So I think that his perspective from the other article, at least in the beginning of this one, is very interesting in that he's clearly trying to say, look at the protest in a different way, because what constitutes a revolt is not atomically constituted by people. It's atomically constituted by contagious gestures, right? So I think that it is quite, I think it's a really concrete example of what it might mean to, let's say, have a sort of impersonal emancipatory point of view, where the opposition to the atomization of people in terms of priceable parts is not, the inverse of it is not people as atoms that compose groups of people, but other weird forms of decomposition, right? Perhaps this is what we're missing here, because, for example, he wouldn't have a problem coming up with a sort of meme form here on top, then a whole theory of gestures that are composable together, or that are kind of forming some way here and forming another experimental sort of revolt here, and this kind of quite rich and quite scalable, right? Because of what counts as what's maximally contagious, right? In opposition, for example, to groups of people. When we made this example of, you have a international and here you have some parties. Well, if you go down the line, ultimately you have a bunch of individuals here indexed to these things. You don't even have like many things. You only have really people, right? Whereas, for example, with this meme form thing, people are actually decomposable into gestures, thousands and thousands of gestures. So this structure here can actually be much more, it can look very differently, right? So I think that the thing that is not clear on our proposal is when we talk about this and there are objects here, we know that this actually is a very, very rich set of ways of decomposing things into the most weird parts, right? And we want to talk about a way of forming new atoms out of these parts that are where I think that's perhaps a very strong underlying hypothesis, that the atoms here are of an organizational nature and not of an individual nature, right? In the sense, so for example, a set of gestures is more organizational than individual. So this reindexing of what composes something, it's something that should be clearer perhaps, because the sort of hypothesis that is behind organizations is the thing that allows us to imagine that this is a very rich thing that's not simply composed of agreeing human groups, right? I don't know. It might be something that's slightly unclear.
Didn't the circle, in a sense, had this it feels like a mimetic intuition, but not of gestures, more of like rule, some sort of like rule following.
Yeah, we had that idea. I think that was the idea, like whatever group that comes with its own rule, it exists, right? Something like that. And part of that rule, like part of the rule was built to guarantee like that the subset exists, and part of the rule was there to guarantee that like a second rule to guarantee that it goes along with another subset, right? So like the basic idea was do whatever in such a way that it's visible to somebody else doing whatever, right? That was pretty much the principle. Which I think goes back to that thing we were saying, which I think it's always a big issue. Like you don't want simply to come up with, let's say, the decomposing principle for a new sort of atom, like from individuals to gestures. You also need to think about the sort of synthetic other aspect, which is how does the gestures go with other things, right? Which is, again, I think this is the complexity and this is the connection thing with Apolito, right?
Mhm.
Or
maybe
an
the
analytic.
Mariology text also has a lot to contribute on this point.
Yeah, I think that the passing of constraints looks a lot like the dissemination of gestures, right?
Yeah, we could probably talk about behaviors too. Gestures, behaviors, like something. There's a lot of different words, like
Yeah.
Enzo was indicating, that we could potentially use there.
The thing the place where I think things start becoming a bit different is that, I think in this sense, Adrian's text is very similar to Badiou, where he wants you to trust a certain reason in revolt that is clear from a sort of impersonal flow perspective, right? But the old commie perspective, where effectivity is measured by the establishing of an alternative kind of self-reproducing thing, you need an added constraint to get to that, right? You want the impersonal, but you also want it to touch on a sort of productive level somehow, right?
Isn't it more about? I have the feeling that has to do a lot to reproduction, like in the sense that
yeah,
because when he talks about the spaces, the sites of life, it's kind of consistency is not given by the gestures anymore. It's about like it's being able to kind of mobilize these pre-existing forms in ways that can kind of like reproduce the movement. So, and that's, I mean, the whole idea of like this more like the cooperatives and this kind of building, kind of a network that it's all about like reproduction, right? Being able to build. So I was kind of like, to me, it seemed that the memes were in this sort of kind of like production of this productive part of militant work in which you measure effects in this kind of like in the way it circulates outside, but you have this kind of reproductive side of militant work in which, you know, it's something else that's kind of like, it's a different kind of consistency, right? It's related to people meeting and people like forming bonds and eating and being able to like not have to work. And so I think it's on this passage, maybe the way that you guys formalized the reproduction part could also like enlighten this.
Yeah, it's true. We perhaps that's the difference. I never thought of it that way. Like,
Yeah, I like that idea. We talked about reproduction in terms of the labor, but we could probably generalize that, right? Every organization has a reproductive dimension to it.
Yeah, exactly. Like in our schema, you have labor power goes through these two things, right? It composes MP and creates some product, and at the same time it composes with means of subsistence to reproduce LP, right? So perhaps we could have it like this. yeah, it's interesting to think about it in this way because, for example, so this is a productive and a reproductive kind of cycle, right? And we did try to show that this cycle here is actually more universal than this cycle here. But it would be interesting perhaps to say that, for example, when you form, right, you have some compositional principle that leads to a body, but you also have a different principle like this, right?
Yeah.
There is a sort of thing like,
I think this also might be an interesting place for that decision as to whether or not a body is sufficient, or if you need like a concept of ecology or economy of bodies.
yeah, I mean,
Really
perhaps
comes
this is the place, right, to add something like this, right? And then you have this reproductive arrow here.
Yeah.
This is not productive in the capitalist sense, but it's compositional, and as production is compositional, but it's right non-value based way of composing things together that gives you B. But then there's still the issue of how this reproduces itself, right? And yeah, I think that there might be something really profound there. Like, again, isn't this exactly what we're saying? We wanted to remove eternity, like, Badiou solves the temporal and spatial issues because after a body has been formed, even if it's destroyed, it has taken place, so it can be resurrected, right? That's his kind of schema for truths. Like, truth happen, like the slave revolt happens, it's destroyed, but once it has happened, it can be taken up by Rosa Luxemburg, right? So he substitutes reproduction for resurrection. And in our case, I think we're trying to kind of project that back into the world. Like, it's not a transworldly resurrection, it's an intra-worldly reproduction, right?
Yeah, and I mean, this reproduction can have the form of like
This
some
is
form
the
of
term, yeah. This is a
it can be
different part.
inactive, right? You can have like cells or like networks that they stop existing in the sense, but the fact that they are able to be kind of like reactivated is what already in a sense reproduces the movement.
Yeah, man, I think that this is really profound because I mean, let's say from this standpoint here, you can say that you, let's say, politically disassociated a body from the world. It's like, this is enough to have, let's say, a sort of idea of dual power, right? Because you have like a world and a body inside of it. But you're kind of not, I mean, you're kind of removing from your concern, like, this can be, let's put it like this can divide the world into two, but it cannot allow you to talk about this becoming like growing, right?
Mm-hmm.
This added point here, it's also about how this can be made more consistent than the thing that existed before. Like, I don't know, it seems to fit what we were talking about.
Yeah, it's if you just leave that picture, it's actually like this, right? Because that same body occupies the new world of TD.
Yeah.
And it comes equipped with a new set of sensors, but the way it senses already presupposes something different. And its reproduction must depend on this other sensibility.
Yeah, man. Now it makes sense to me. Like, let's just number these parts here, right? So one is when you have this, right, with A inside. Two is when you have, I mean, and we're coming close to the thing you were talking about, Renzo, when we met, like trying to schematize these different versions of relations between worlds and bodies. Like in this case, you have the body here only, and then I'll just skip to 4. In the case of 4, what you have is a world with a body, a separate world with a new body, and you're able to claim that this is this. This is a resurrection, right? What I wrote here. Like, so eternity is the common medium, right? Which I mean, but you already proved this to be true. So it's not, this is not an idealist problem. This is real, but it's perhaps a bit too much, right? And I think that this is what Dennis drew there is a separate thing, which is where you have a world and a body, and it is intersecting with a different world in this way, right? Without the aid of eternity, right? So
It sounds like a lot like the transition problem in categories.
I was thinking about it. Yeah, it looks like we're talking about transitioning between worlds.
Yeah. We can now prove the lower to upper communism in categories, so it works in real life.
It's amazing.
Right, but I think that this is the point here, right? Like from in this tension here is you're the weaker link in a dual power structure, right? And in this tension here, you're the stronger kind of the dominating aspect in the world structure, right?
Well, it's interesting too to like consider in terms of a lot of the debates, especially like the debates around the dual power in Germany, like that the question, like, and this is from like Trotsky's perspective, so I know that's very contentious, but like a lot of his stuff wasn't like, oh, does the working class have the power and whatnot? It was, do they have the confidence of other classes to just like maintain shit? Like it was a political question of reproducibility, but not just of a body in like a Baduvian evental sense, but also in this kind of like broader world in which bodies exist. But reproducibility, the capacity to manage reproducibility was a very real question in all this. So it's kind of interesting to see this map out logically.
Yeah, I don't know. It makes a lot of sense to me to think that, you know, reproduction is kind of the issue here, you know, because then I think that if these are points, this is not points, right? This is something slightly different. You have a body that is treating points. You want something that, again, will turn a sort of local perspective into a free-floating perspective, right? You want something that from this standpoint here looks like experimentally trying things out and composing things together, to something that from this perspective on here looks more like how do we put this, like a more pragmatic minimal set of parameters that you can kind of provisorily trust, that does give you the general coherence, right? I mean, the question that Trotsky put is exactly this, like, do people take confidence in the Soviets, for example? If people trust Soviets, it's not a question of, let's say, will new points be treated, really, right? It's like, is there a representation of a coherent world where Soviets are in charge that people can factor into their decisions?
Yeah, totally.
Right? I mean, I'm just trying to find a place where, if reproduction is here, isn't there something epistemological right here, in the same way that decisions were here and experiments were here, perhaps?
Yeah, something like abductive or imaginative, you know, like,
yeah,
I would put like artistic production in that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not political, but it's kind of giving you a sort of mental view of things, right? Or
It's funny because on the meme text, he also maps into like an effect which is confidence, which now makes sense in this certain. I mean, he interprets in this kind of like too personal way, but I think it's related to this epistemic relation to some sort of some other logic, right? That starts to be discerned.
Yeah, I'm just gonna redo this and take a picture just so I don't forget. No, sorry, this is TD. Actually, this is not TD, right? This is for him just another world. I mean, but it's not as crass as I am. And this is resurrection. Yeah, and I have the impression that, okay, so. Yeah, this thing here is a sort of, yeah, because Badiou is very keen on this whole idea of, you know, confidence being the, but it's interesting because I would say that confidence goes here and belief goes here. Yeah. You know, like confidence is like, okay, trust that this can have effects, but belief is the sort of pragmatic, you know, picturing of things, right?
Or maybe
You
imagination.
can not have confidence in someone, but still believe that they'll follow through in a weird kind of way.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, this is resurrection here. It appears in a different world, right? And this means it can be taken up in a different world, but we're trying to talk about this kind of inner. Yeah, so I mean,
when the arrow goes back from B prime to B, does that mean that there's a kind of futurity operating within the event? Like I'm not, or the body, or?
Yeah, I mean, for Badiou, I think you mean this arrow here, right? I don't know why I put it like this. It's just that it seems like if I added the Platonic way that I thought of it, right? It turns in the sense of any possible world, right? It just means that that this thing here is always just an instance of this thing here, right?
Okay, gotcha. Yeah.
But I'm just freestyling here. I'm not sure if this is a good way of putting it, but yeah, but it's still, like,
you could almost put the communist hypothesis in eternity too, right? Like there's something.
Yeah, perfect. Let's yeah, exactly. And so the arrows that seem weird are these ones, right? These are the ones that are kind of new.
Yeah, A to B would be close related to tactic, right?
Yeah, I think it's this here would be like something between, we could call like experimentation, tactic, action, something that has to do with composition in a way that the principle of composition is the principle for this action, this process is only cleared by this process, right? It's not necessarily intelligible from here, right? So why mix these people with that people? From this perspective makes no sense. They're just separate or they have nothing to do with each other. So this looks crazy, but from this perspective, this doesn't look crazy, right? So in a certain sense, I think you can call this like this tactical experimental sort of thing. You can imagine that even at this level, you're already requiring that these compositions have guarantee some coherence between the things that they're composing, but it can be very innovative or crazy what we mean by coherence, right? I think that everything that Adrian is writing could fit here, like to have confidence in this kind of gesture compositions, and this gives rise to some sort of new solidarity that kind of creates an intelligibility of the solidarity principle, right? So I think that this kind of covers a huge set of kind of different tactical and sort of strategic phenomenology, right? The issue is, okay, but you can ask of this that it be composed in such a way as to obtain for this arrow as well, that this is possible, right? And what is this constraint? And we know that it has something to do with turning this sort of interplay between your coherence and your decisions, your confidence, into something slightly more almost like detached from politics. Is a weird thing, like almost like, right, there's something about mapping here, I think, which is something that we know that money does, right? And there's something here also about kind of the way that you filter these decisions into, or how they get kind of projected.
Like experience also, right? The way that you talk about like how you accumulate like some sort of stuff after action after.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not really sure how I would, but I do think that this kind of brings us closer to the question we were at the beginning. Like, it at least opens up a sort of realm of asking questions that are kind of attached to the problem of composition. So, like, let's say, and do perhaps let's say, isn't this like, couldn't this be the, like, this is the do kind of part and this is the update kind of part in it?
That definitely seems like the direction.
Right, like this seems to be like the first part here seems to be very kind of compositionally driven, decision driven, experimentally driven, and the second part seems to be like, how does everything, like the totality, start looking like almost like the set of irreversible kind of ways of looking at things after this body is around, right?
I'm also wondering if maybe there's like a nesting phenomena between the two, where in the first one you have kind of like a simple optic, but you're kind of testing your optic in the first place. You're constructing some way to sense the world from A to B, but then you're assessing how that kind of like fits in with a larger series of optics and a larger series of kind of tests. And it, like that shift, that diagram or the animation you went back to that moves from an optic to a comb.
Yeah.
And the way that's transformed, that also seems to be important here, that you take like a limited part and then kind of unfold it into a larger organizational whole.
That's very interesting, I think, because, you know, like the reproductive, I mean, I don't know, I find that very, very inspiring to think that perhaps this shouldn't be a body here. This should be like an environment. You know, like, as in saying that this, I mean, it has a lot to do with reproduction, right? This is the world, the dual power described as a set of organizations. So it's described as this, a bunch of these things, right? That are doing things and learning things, and then you want to kind of compose them together, and these things, learning things, but they're still, as we were talking about, there is a world and they're in it, right? And this thing here is the same process, but described in the inverse, right? Where, let's say, this is the body, right? And this is the remaining of the world. So this now looks like the environment, and this looks like the system, right?
Yeah, it's really Bogdanovian.
This is this is crazy Bogdanovian. Yeah.
Well, it seems like that's where the right side of the eternal becomes important, because it kind of gives us a way to like move that boundary between system and, like, it gives us some way to still have a criterion without it being like too substantial or something. But it seems like that right side is important to kind of like maintain consistency in the process of moving from body to environment in some weird way.
Yeah, I mean, we perhaps the environment is to lose the world, but like again, like moving from the organization seen from their insights, right, to considering their composition as a milieu, right, which is like an economy or an ecology, right? I mean, I think that makes a lot of weird sense, because I mean, there is this movement that is very hard to name that happens when, I mean, I think it's a good movement to talk about conviction or confidence to belief, where, for example, militant activity is no longer the exception in your life, but it's just the thing that happens, like part of your routine. Like, it doesn't mobilize you anymore in terms of I'm going against the grain. It's just that thing that already fits with the other parts of your life, with your friends, with what you're doing. Like, it becomes the path of least action, right?
Mm-hmm.
That has a lot to do with how reproduction works, right? And I think that this is also a good kind of, it brings a nice twist to the problem of synergy, because synergy sometimes looks like, like solidarity, synergy, cooperation. They have this kind of exceptional flavor.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's always a weird mix, a weird economic calculation. How much effort you take to put yourself in a position where you take less effort. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, in a protest, you stop your work as a delivery rider, whatever, a delivery boy, whatever it's called, and in order to do the strike, right? So you pay a high cost to do an activity that is much lower cost, because workers protesting together, they have much more force than alone. So it seems like economically, the body is pretty much still the place where you need to kind of let go of a more worldly account of costs in view of the synergistic gain of politics, right? This economic point of view of activist work is precisely one where the activism becomes the lower cost in the daily life. Like, for example, if you take like people who live with the Zapatistas, for example, it costs less to behave like a Zapatista than to, it's not the same sort of thing as a protest. In which sense it's not a protest just to wake up in the morning and, do what everyone around you is doing.
It seems like that could get translated into the kind of homotopy type language of paths, that in a way you're kind of reconfiguring paths to make it easier in the move from B to the eco or something.
Yeah, something like that.
Oh, this is sweet.
Dude, I don't know, man. This seems like it's important.
It's also really nice from within the perspective of social reproduction theory, around, because there's all these debates about whether or not there's unitary theories or multiple systems, unitary systems, multiple systems, and this really gives a way to show a unitary system with kind of multiple transcendentals at work, but in which reproduction is like a fundamental issue and not like, I don't know, it just really dovetails with a lot of other things.
Yeah, man, it really does. And I mean, without talking about it, this totally fits I mean, from this perspective here, you can already tell that this is the structure, that D is maximally reaching and these three are less reaching, right? It's kind of already implied in what we're talking about, that if this change happens, whatever makes B intelligible is the maximally reaching transcendental.
Yeah.
I like
without
this.
any kind of like moral language or inherent like value of labor, like it's There's something very powerful about how simple it all is.
Shit.
Yeah.
It's really nice.
Yes, I think we should stop there while we're ahead.
I
Before-
send the small the drawings that. you mentioned.
Good.
Oh, thank you.
Guys, I need to go. Luisa was already here twice, like pointing to me and making like faces like we need to have dinner, and I need to take care of some reproduction as well. Otherwise, I'm just gonna starve.
Thanks, everyone. This
Okay.
was a great meeting.
Great, guys. See ya.
Take care.
Bye bye.